Across the southeast of Africa, parts of Madagascar too, though Cape Town staying dry and sunny to end the week. Much of the Middle East will be dry and sunny, but it's cooler, showery, quite windy across the Levant into Iraq and the Caucasus. Some snow here over the higher ground for Friday and into the start of the weekend. A lot of dry and sunny and hot weather for South Asia, particularly central northern India. But again, we see the threat of showers and storms breaking out across southern and western India and into Sri Lanka. Some of them will be quite intense. This vigorous area of low pressure will bring some wet weather to southern and eastern China on Friday. Pretty strong winds as well coming up from the south. The wet windy weather will sweep into the Korean Peninsula, southern Japan for the start of the weekend. Finally, for Australia, well, it's dry, sunny and hot across the west. Some very unwelcome rainfall likely across New South Wales, southern Queensland Friday into the weekend. And slowly we see that area of low pressure pull away from New Zealand's North Island. So here it's a gradual improvement this weekend.
Alone, we break the rules. Together, we make the rules. Alone, they say we are feisty. Together, we are fearless. Shout alone, they call us hysterical. Shout together, we can be historical. This is a new perspective, inclusive, not selective. One will sacrifice, we all make a gain. One wins, we all take the prize. One stands, we all rise. 100 Women, a series of inspiring and challenging stories across the BBC.
What we hope and pray that finally after 40 years the people of Afghanistan will have peace and stability.
My view of feminism is still really the same, which is that I think feminism is fundamentally a justice movement.
Africa will always remain important for me, and so I will continue doing what I do.
I could not have had a career as a gay man.
When big names talk, they talk to the BBC.
Brussels pledged more military aid to Ukraine and strengthen their presence in Eastern Europe.
Allies are also equipping Ukraine with significant military supplies, including anti-tank and air defense systems and drones, which are proving highly effective.
Ukrainian military says it's destroyed a Russian landing ship in the port of Berdyansk, west of the besieged city of Mariupol. Calls for the UN to do more after the Taliban backtracked on its committed workers without consulting unions broke the law.
I completely hold our hands up, my hands up, our hands up, that we did choose not to consult.
That's quite amazing, isn't it? You're coming to this parliament, putting your hands up and saying you willfully chose to break the law.
And the British Chancellor defends his spring spending statement, saying he's taken action to support those affected by the rising cost of living. But one think tank says more than 1 million people will now be pushed into poverty from April. Putin had hoped or planned. There are estimates that some 10,000 Russian troops have died, with between 30 and 40,000 injured. Western intelligence agencies suggest Russian troops are increasingly demoralized, and some of them even risk being encircled near the capital, Kiev, where Ukrainian forces have been counterattacking. NATO leaders are meeting in Brussels, where they have pledged more military aid to Ukraine, including the means to help the country defend itself against biological, chemical or nuclear attacks, as well as cyber warfare. More on that shortly, but first, James Waterhouse has this report from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev.
At 5 in the morning on the 24th of February, this city woke up to the unthinkable. After months of gathering his troops on Ukraine's borders and the endless speculation over what he was planning, Vladimir Putin launched his invasion.
I have decided to conduct a special military operation. Its aim is to protect people who have been subjected to tortures and genocide from the Kiev regime for 8 years. Whoever tries to interfere with us or threaten our country should know that Russia's response will be immediate and lead to such consequences that have never been experienced in history.
There were the thuds of airstrikes. Police on megaphones were telling people to get to safety. There were the sounds of jets People were afraid, and most couldn't believe what was happening. Many predicted Kiev would fall quickly. President Zelensky would be removed and Russia could achieve its goal. That goal hasn't yet been.
We are waiting for peace in our Ukraine.
But right now it's on daily basis. Fear of, bullets, fear of bombs.
Bombs are continuing to fall on other surrounding Ukrainian cities like Chernihiv and Mariupol in the southeast, where the Russians have made the most gains. They've also suffered big losses. NATO thinks between 7,000 and 14,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. As Vladimir Putin continues to be frustrated, the question is how many more lives will be lost or destroyed. James Waterhouse, BBC News in Kiev.
Okay, let's just see some pictures now of that Russian ship burning in Berdyansk. Let's just show you those. It's being reported the landing ship is anchored off the occupied port west of the besieged city of Mariupol. It's understood a massive explosion was seen above the ship. There are unverified reports of another 2 ships ablaze. Taking the port city of Mariupol is a key part of Russia's effort to create a land corridor linking the occupied territories of Crimea and the Donbass. The corridor would establish a supply line to Russian forces on the southern flank. Now, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg says leaders have pledged more to support Ukraine. Speaking after today's emergency summit, he confirmed that the alliance would also do more to help the country defend itself against biological, chemical or nuclear attacks, as well as cyber warfare.
On land, we will have substantially more forces in the eastern part of the alliance at higher readiness, with more pre-positioned equipment and supplies. In the air, we will deploy more jets and strengthen our integrated air and missile defense. At sea, we will have carrier strike groups, submarines, and significant numbers of combat ships on a persistent basis. We will also strengthen our cyber defenses and enhance our exercises, focusing on collective defense and interoperability. I expect we will decide on the details at our next summit in Madrid in June. Today, Allied leaders also agreed to provide further support to Ukraine, helping to uphold their fundamental right to self-defense. Allies are also equipping Ukraine with significant military supplies, including anti-tank and air defense systems and drones, which are proving highly effective, as well as substantial financial and humanitarian aid.
Jens Stoltenberg there. Well, when answering a question on how serious the threat of chemical, radiological and nuclear threats could be, Mr. Stoltenberg said such actions would totally change the nature of the conflict.
We are concerned, partly because we see the rhetoric and we see that Russia is trying to create some kind of pretext accusing Ukraine, United States, NATO allies for preparing to use chemical and biological weapons. And we have seen before that this way of accusing others is actually a way to create a pretext for do the same themselves. And of course, the accusations against Ukraine and NATO allies are absolutely false. Any use of chemical weapons will totally change the nature of the conflict. It will be a blatant violation of international law, and it will have widespread consequences and, of course, be extremely dangerous.
NATO Secretary-General there. Well, let's go straight to our Jessica Parker, who joins me from Brussels. And Jessica, clearly his greatest concern in that press conference and in general for all these NATO leaders is chemical, biological warfare.
Hi, MCL.
Can you hear me, Jessica? No, we have lost Jessica Parker in Brussels, but we will go back to her as soon as we get it. So here we are 1 month into this war with the Russian advance stalled and thousands of its troops dead. Ukrainian forces, meanwhile, are counterattacking. Our security correspondent Frank Gardner has this assessment of the Russian military campaign and the problems its troops have encountered.
So just why has it gone so badly for Russia in these first few weeks of the war? Well, there are a number of reasons. There is the strength of Ukrainian resistance. Most of the population has rallied around their government. The troops are using Western-supplied weapons like Javelin and Stinger missiles. And when it comes to getting inside big cities, Russia doesn't have enough troops to take on the defenders in most cases. Here's their charismatic president, Volodymyr Zelensky, a one-time comic actor who's rallied the nation, refusing to leave the capital, even though there's a bounty on his head. Then there's poor Russian tactics. Russian commanders on the ground have largely failed to take full advantage of all the tools at their disposal. Things like armoured vehicles, artillery, rocket launchers, helicopters, all of which, when combined with infantry, can have a massive effect, but which the Russians have failed to master. The Russian Air Force is 15 times bigger than Ukraine's, yet they've failed to achieve supremacy in the skies. And finally, there's poor Russian logistics and communications. Russian soldiers have not always maintained their vehicles properly, meaning that many of them are breaking down. And when it comes to radios, a lot of them don't work, forcing them to use mobile phones, which can easily be intercepted by the Ukrainians. Many of the Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine thought they were just going on exercise, like this one in Belarus. That didn't give them enough time to prepare for battle.
Exercises never prepared troops properly for combat, so that they were not combat ready. And that puts real strain on the non-commissioned officers, the sergeants and the corporals, to get things ready in time, make sure the troops do their job properly. And in the Russian army, the sergeants and the corporals are renowned for their inefficiency, their corruption, and the bad relationships they have with the soldiers. So everything that could go wrong, more or less did go wrong.
And today, a small victory for Ukraine on the Sea of Azov. Its forces claim to have destroyed a Russian amphibious landing ship. Russia still has plenty more ships, but the fact Ukrainians are still fighting back 1 month on shows Russia has grossly underestimated them. Frank Gardner, BBC News.
OK, let's go back to our Jessica Parker, and I think we've got you this time, Jess. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
We were just hearing from Jens Stoltenberg, who was expressing his concern about chemical and biological warfare, clearly top of the agenda there for NATO leaders.
Yeah, very much so, and I think it will be something that will be discussed here as well at the European Council of EU leaders, and of course President Biden, the US president, is expected to join that European Council. We even think he's going to walk up this red carpet here. They've just recently put some US flags next to some European Union flags, and I think certainly in terms of concerns about an escalation in the type of warfare, there are warnings of consequences should something like that occur. And in terms of the European Union, of course, it's not a military alliance, it is largely an economic alliance. So the discussion as to what could happen as a consequence would, of course, be potentially more sanctions. But to be honest with you, already some countries in the EU want more sanctions now. Latvia's Prime Minister has just arrived for this summit, and he is saying that tonight he will push for a discussion on energy sanctions, particularly oil and coal. So that's oil and coal imports from Russia, because there is a particular concern amongst particularly Poland, Baltic states, Eastern Central European countries in the EU that Europe is sending money to Russia to pay for these energy imports, and that money is being used to fund President Putin's war. But there are countries, notably Germany, who are really not keen on any kind of overnight energy embargo.
Yeah, and just I suppose in many ways, many of these European NATO leaders are feeling the pressure from President Zelensky as well, who night and day is addressing their parliaments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the diplomatic efforts of President Zelensky, he has been beaming in via video link to the European Parliament, the UK Parliament, the G7 today, NATO today. He'll do it again tonight, this afternoon, for the European Council as well, where, of course, he always calls for more support, things like a no-fly zone, which, of course, NATO is saying it won't do, but also just always pressing for more sanctions and giving these assessments of what's happening on the ground, clearly very disturbing, upsetting, horrific developments in particular places like Mariupol. So I think there is a lot of pressure on leaders to look at what more they can do. And I think it'll be interesting tonight to see whether the presence of President Biden, who's only here for a couple of hours, whether his presence does anything to galvanise the EU to go further in terms of sanctions, because there are member states who use this phrase sanctions fatigue. They think that after 4 rounds of sanctions, which are unprecedented in terms of the EU, not just in terms of what they were, but how fast they were passed as well, but some member states think sanctions fatigue is setting in, and that it is time to do more. So I think that will certainly be part of the discussions today.
Yeah, and I suppose in many ways, President Biden has, sort of talked about the unity within NATO. They want to show that there is something that will come out of this summit as well, because we don't often see summits like these, frankly. I mean, Jess, I'm also trying to hang on to you as long as possible because I want to see President Biden walk past you, just behind you.
Right. Yeah, no, I don't know exactly when that might happen, but you never know. But yeah, I mean, look, I think overall, take a step back, there has been a lot of unity in the West, and today is to some extent symbolic of that. President Biden crossing the Atlantic for the first time since Russia invaded Ukraine to show solidarity with the West, with Europe, as a war takes place on European soil. But I think there are some serious political purposes as well, defence spending really being one of them. As I say, the EU is not a military alliance, but it is actively talking about doing more around defence, working more closely together, spending more on defence. We've seen already a commitment from Germany to spend more on defence, matching NATO targets, 2% of GDP. And I think the US has long wanted to see other NATO members spend more on defence, and Russia's invasion has brought that issue to the fore and has actually pushed some countries in that direction. So while I think it's true to say that EU countries, in terms of their unity, has frayed a bit in terms of what to do next on sanctions, overall, actually, Russia's invasion of Ukraine does appear to have breathed new life into NATO and seen unprecedented Western unity in the EU, in NATO. And of course, there's been a G7 summit as well today, 3 summits in one day. And this one, of course, goes on into tomorrow.
OK, Jessica, thanks so much for that update. No doubt at some point he will walk there behind you. Now, many reservists and ordinary citizens have taken up arms to defend their country against the Russian invaders. Earlier,
with the unions, we chose not to do that because we believe...
You chose to break the law?
Because we chose not to consult, and we will will compensate everybody in full for that.
The ferry crews were sacked so they could be replaced with cheaper agency workers.
The average hourly rate of pay is £5.50.
That's below the national minimum wage of this country. How do you reconcile that?
Where we are governed by national minimum wage, we will absolutely pay national minimum wage. This is an international seafaring model that is consistent with models throughout the globe and our competitors.
But unions had already told MPs what they thought the company was trying to do.
That's what P&O are aiming to achieve, to kill our merchant marine and to kill our employment laws. And something's got to be done about it today. The Prime Minister said he's going to prosecute. This government has got to intervene now, impound these ships and get our people back to work.
Meanwhile, P&O's ferries stand idle. Services on most routes are still suspended as the new crews are trained up. Eventually, they'll sail again. But the political storm stirred up by P&O's actions shows no sign of dying down. Theo Leggett, BBC News.
Now, the British Chancellor Rishi Sunak has defended the measures he set out yesterday to help people with the rising cost of living. Critics say he hasn't done enough, with one think tank warning that 1.3 million people will fall below the poverty line from April. The main opposition party, Labour, has called the policies a disaster for working families. Here's our political correspondent, Ian Watson.
The view from Downing Street the morning after, the day before. Rishi Sunak had a spring in his step yesterday when he took 5p a litre off fuel duty, and he was pumped when he announced a pre-election income tax cut. But with living standards set to fall further than in any year since the 1950s, today he faced accusations that he hadn't grasped the scale of the cost of living crisis. But he argued it helped millions of people by blunting the impact of his national insurance rise.
Raising national insurance thresholds, which is a tax cut for £330 for up to 30 million workers, and then getting around to cutting income tax. Those are all tax-cutting measures. We also cut tax for businesses to make it cheaper for them to employ staff. It's the hardest part about this job, not being able to do everything that people would like you to do. But I can't make every problem go away, but where we can make a difference, we want to, and that's what yesterday was about.
But even some newspapers, which are usually supportive of the Conservatives, are pressing the Chancellor to do more, as are some of his own MPs.
Many of my constituents in South Dorset are impoverished already. We have deep pockets of deprivation and poverty, and I fear that despite the generous moves by the Chancellor and the tinkering that he's done, haven't gone far enough.
The Treasury would point out that many factors pushing up prices globally are beyond its control, but the opposition's accusing the Chancellor of making the wrong political choices. There's now a big political dividing line between the government and the opposition. They're claiming that the Chancellor simply isn't doing enough to help consumers and is letting big corporations off the hook. Now, next year, Rishi Sunak does intend to increase taxes on big business. But Labour and Liberal Democrats say what's needed is action now to tackle the profits of the big energy companies.
What I would have done yesterday as Chancellor would have been to introduce a windfall tax on the big profits being made by North Sea oil and gas companies at the moment.
Overall, we want a fairer tax system, don't we? We want to tax those people who've got these huge profits in the oil and gas companies and take taxes down for struggling families.
The Treasury has rejected that approach, arguing it would reduce much-needed investment in energy production. But even some of Rishi Sunak's own MPs are saying privately he'll have to expend more economic and political energy himself to tackle the current crisis. Ian Watson, BBC News, Westminster.
OK, we'll be going back to all the latest news in a moment, but let's go and get all the latest sports news now. And Louisa joins us. Louisa.
Thanks, Yalda. Yes, a host of nations around the world are hoping to take a step towards the World Cup finals in Qatar. Wales's Gareth Bale has declared himself fit for the playoff semi-final with Austria later in their Path A group. Bale dropped out of the Real Madrid squad for Sunday's El Clasico against Barcelona with what was described as a little niggle. Wales haven't qualified for a World Cup since 1958, and Bale is determined to change that.
No, it's something that I would love to achieve for myself, for my country, for the fans of Wales. We deserve to kind of be in the World Cup. It's been a long time, so but no, it won't be a regret, but it'll be a regret if we don't give it 100%. So the main thing for us is we go out on the pitch, all of us give 100%. We don't leave anything left in the tank, and yeah, I think once you've done that, there's never going to be any regrets, regardless of the result.
European champions Italy are one of the biggest teams in action. They face North Macedonia in their playoff semi-final in Palermo later. The Italians have some injury problems, though, and are missing at least 3 of their starting back 4. They've had a difficult time in World Cups in recent years. Italy were knocked out in the group stage both in 2010 and 2014 and failed to qualify for Russia in 2018. So the winners of Italy v North Macedonia will earn a playoff final against Portugal or Turkey. Portugal have some injuries. Will be without their 2 first-choice centre-backs. Ruben Diaz has a hamstring problem, while Pepe is missing after testing positive for later. In Path B, Sweden play the Czech Republic. The resurgence of England's women at the Cricket World Cup has taken them to the verge of the semi-finals after an outstanding astounding 9-wicket win over Pakistan. They made a dreadful start to the tournament, but Catherine Brunt was back in form, taking 3 wickets as Pakistan were swept aside for 105, and England raced to their target inside just 20 overs. Danny Wyatt with an impressive 76 not out. That moves the defending champions into the top 4 of the round-robin group. They'll make the semis if they avoid defeat to Bangladesh on Sunday. England's men are also in action. It's day 1 of the 3rd and final test against the West Indies in Grenada. And it's all to play for as the first 2 tests ended in a draw. So whoever wins this test wins the series. West Indies won the toss and put England into bat. That is looking like to have been a good decision as Zach Crawley was out for just 7 runs and captain Joe Root followed shortly afterwards. He was out for a duck. England are 35 for 2. Now, after Ashley Barty stunned the tennis world by announcing her retirement at the age of 25, she's been talking about her decision overnight. The Wimbledon and Australian Open champion has set a date for her wedding. She's not ruled out competing in golf or Aussie rules football, but her main focus, she says, is giving something back to tennis, especially when it comes to encouraging young Indigenous Australians into the sport.
I know that my contribution with the Aboriginal and Indigenous side of our sport will only grow. I'm really excited for that. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to give Indigenous youth and Aboriginal youth around our nation more opportunity to get into the sport, and that's something that we'll work on down the track, but I am excited to spend more time in that space.
Well, that is all the sport for now. Back to you, Yalda.
Louisa, thank you so much. Now, when Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine exactly 4 weeks ago, all eyes were on the capital, Kiev, as Russian forces advanced from all directions. But the Russian army had other objectives too, and taking the southern port city of Mariupol was high among them. If they could do this, they would be able to join up Russian-held Crimea with the Russian-held areas of eastern Ukraine and create a land corridor to Russia itself. Around 100,000 people are believed to be trapped there, with supplies running out and aid blocked from entering. Residents have endured weeks of when the building took a direct hit from a Russian airstrike. Within seconds, the theatre had split in 2 and was left in ruins. Well, earlier I spoke with Igor Mostovoy, an opera singer from Mariupol. He used to prepare or perform at the theatre and spoke with me about his memories there.
I performed many times in the theater when I was a kid as well. So when I just started singing, it was one of the places where I was at first dreaming to be. And then when I went on that stage, it was a feeling of joy, of happiness to be there and to be in one of the main theaters of the city. And the last time I performed there was on the 8th of March of 2021 for the International Women's Day to congratulate our mothers, our sisters, and all of the women of the city. A point of bringing something bright and human became the symbol of inhuman deeds of Russia in Ukraine and in my city.
Yeah, we're just looking at the pictures now of the destroyed theatre. But I just wonder if we can just play a little bit of a clip of you performing at the theatre. We're just listening to it there, but I just want our audiences to hear your voice. I wonder if we...
Thank you.
I think they're lining that up now. Let's have a listen. Incredible voice there, Igor. And you were due to perform in many European cities in April. But of course, because of martial law, you can't leave the country now.
Exactly, yes. I'm trying to find an official way to leave the country because these concerts that are organized by my agents in Europe, they're meant to support my country. They're meant to support my city, and all of the money and financial support that I'll be able to get from these concerts are supposed to go towards supporting my country and people in need. And I hope it will be possible for me to go and do this because I find my mission in supporting my country in this way.
Yeah,
and I hope it will be possible.
Igor, we know of the devastation in Mariupol, horrific stories of mass graves, bodies in the streets, no heating, no water, no food, people running out of food. You still have family there. Just tell us about the situation for them.
Exactly. I have my brother there. I just got a news that my uncle was evacuated, unfortunately, to the Russian side, but my brother is still there, and we didn't have connection to him for 5 days already. And my stepsister, so this uncle who was evacuated, his daughter, we've lost all kinds of connection with her, and she's lost, and we don't know where she is.
That must be terrifying.
And it's impossible. It is. It keeps us in constant stress and constant shock of everything that is happening. We just hope that she is alive. We hope that my brother is alive, and we've lost all kinds of hope that my grandfather, who also is in Mariupol, and he was already in state that he couldn't walk by himself and he couldn't eat by himself. So we've lost hope that he is alive.
That's Igor Mostovoy, an opera singer from Mariupol who has managed to be evacuated. Now, more than 3.5 million people have now fled Ukraine in the months since the war began, with more than 2 million of them crossing into Poland. Our correspondent Mark Lowen has been there since the first day and sent this report from the border.
It's been a month of lives ripped up, a generation driven out, certainty torn apart. A month that we've been here, seeing the heartbreak of the sick forced to flee, but compassion too of hearts and homes opened, of the democratic world standing up to the aggressor. 4 weeks on, the only change is warmer weather. The arrivals keep coming, seeking safety from a war some don't understand, welcomed where Poland can put them, this a school, a smile for the kids at the ready. Inside, volunteers bring comfort after an exhausting journey. Yulia Kirienko and her sons fled Kiev, her husband staying to fight.
Children were killed and teenage girls were raped. We had to leave. They were shooting at the cars as we tried to escape. We prayed as we drove. It's good here, but we want to go home. I just want this to end.
The trauma on the youngest could take years to show and last a lifetime. Olga Oleshko's little ones already feel it.
They were asking why helicopters were flying, why there were sirens, why people were dying. I had to explain it in a way that didn't hurt them.
At the start of the invasion, we watched as panic prompted the immediate first rush to escape. But these are the people who didn't want to leave, thinking they could stick it out, that the bombs might stop. But they didn't stop, and more than 3.5 million refugees later, there's a growing feeling of the long term about this, with all the challenges that will entail. Destination Warsaw, whose population is up by almost a fifth. New arrivals given ID numbers and school places. They have a journey to safety, but their country still has no passage to peace. Mark Lowen, BBC News, on the Poland-Ukraine border.
Well, while Western military assistance to Ukraine helps sustain the fightback of Ukrainian troops on the ground, humanitarian and medical assistance from the EU countries is helping prop up Ukrainian hospitals. Some of that help reaches Ukraine from Italy via Romania, as Nick Thorpe reports.
Ambulances donated by the Italian government passed through the Romanian border at Siret. Other humanitarian supplies go through Poland and will soon start through Slovakia. 1 month into the war, Ukraine is grateful for every form of support it can get. These boxes contain drugs, bandages, surgical equipment, mobile X-ray machines, even lights for operating theatres.
На Україні сьогодні дуже багато людей, які
We have many injured people who immensely need the medical supplies donated by the European Union. We distribute these items to places where we have the most difficult cases in the hospitals, and with these medicines we help people who have suffered from the Russian aggression.
First, the handover.
We hope that very soon we will win and we will all together celebrate our victory.
These trucks have just arrived here from northern Italy, containing medical supplies and equipment donated by the Italian government, coordinated by the European Union. From here, they're being loaded into Ukrainian trucks and taken across the border to the city of Chernivtsi.
For a moment, it could almost be Italy. Less than an hour to the border. The colours of the Ukrainian flag are everywhere. Over the rolling plains, the foothills of the Carpathians. The smoke rising here is just from burning straw. Memories of peacetime. Nick Thorpe, BBC News, Siret on the Romania-Ukraine border.
Now to other stories making headlines. Let's get some other news. The South Korean military says North Korea has fired a suspended long-range ballistic missile. The Japanese Coast Guard said the suspected missile has landed in its waters some 170 kilometers off Japan. The South Korean President Moon Jae-in has convened a national security meeting in response to the test. North Korea has carried out a record number of weapons tests this year. It has not tested an intercontinental ballistic missile since 2017. Here's how Japan and South Korea reacted.
The government strongly condemned the launch as it is a clear violation of UN Security Council resolutions and a reversal of the moratorium on intercontinental ballistic missile launches, which North Korea had promised to the international community.
It is estimated to have flown 1,100 kilometers at an altitude of over 6,000 kilometers. The launch is a serious threat to Japan's security. North Korea launched the missile without any warning, and it landed in Japan's exclusive economic zone.
South Korea has responded by test firing its own missiles. None of them were aimed at North Korea. Laura Bicker, BBC Seoul correspondent, has more.
This was a big missile. It flew for more than an hour and landed just 170 kilometers from Japan's coastline. Officials in Tokyo say that this is a new type of intercontinental ballistic missile. If true, then that will mean that this is the first time since November 2017 that North Korea has fired such a weapon. South Korean military have said in the last few hours that it fired 5 missiles in response. They came from the air, the sea and the ground. Again, the first time that has happened since 2017. This feels like a major escalation on the Korean peninsula. Back in 2017, when we had fire and fury, it led to talks between Donald Trump, the then US president, and the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. At that time, Kim Jong-un promised not to test these long-range weapons. The reason that analysts really kind of wonder about these weapons is the fact that they could have the potential to reach the United States. And that is why so many people are currently concerned. The world's attention has been elsewhere, and the Biden administration has made it clear that North Korea is not their priority, although they have said that they are willing to meet with officials from North Korea at any time, although they're not willing to give any more concessions. Pyongyang is proving once again, after 12 missile tests in this year alone, and now this potential intercontinental ballistic missile, that it is capable of producing new weapons, capable of going further and faster, even though it's under strict economic sanctions.
Laura Bicker reporting there from Seoul. Now, a senior British judge has concluded that the ruler of Dubai inflicted exorbitant domestic abuse on his ex-wife, Princess Haya. Sir Andrew McFarlane said that 72-year-old Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum consistently displayed coercive and controlling behaviour with respect to those members of his family who he regards as behaving contrary to his will. Princess Haya will now have sole responsibility for their 2 children. His ruling marks the end of a 3-year custody battle at the High Court in London. Now, Prince William has expressed profound sorrow at abhorrent slavery in a speech to dignitaries during his visit to Jamaica. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge are currently on the second leg of their tour of the Caribbean in honour of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. Our royal correspondent Johnny Diamond reports from Kingston, and just a warning, his report contains flash photography.
In swept the couple for dinner with the great and the good of Jamaica. Ever since this trip was announced, a question hung over it. How would William address the issue of slavery, the brutal exploitation of hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans when Jamaica was run by Britain?
I strongly agree with my father, the Prince of Wales, who said in Barbados last year that the appalling atrocity of slavery forever stains our history. I want to express my profound sorrow. Slavery was abhorrent, and it should never have happened.
This has been quite a political part of the Caribbean tour, because earlier the Jamaican Prime Minister made very clear to the couple in front of the cameras that he wanted an end to the role of the Queen as the head of state here and to the constitutional link to Britain.
Jamaica is, as you would see, a country that is very proud of our history, very proud of what we have achieved, and we are moving on. And we intend to attain in short order our development goals and fulfill our true ambitions. Independent, developed, prosperous country.
William tried to answer some of the questions about Britain's past in Jamaica with his speech. Less clear is what the royal family's future, if any, is in a truly independent Jamaica. Johnny Diamond, BBC News, Kingston.
Let's get more news now from Ukraine, because both Russia and Ukraine produce a third of the world's wheat and barley exports, which feed millions of people in the Middle East, Asia and Africa. Well, earlier I spoke to UN Assistant Secretary General Miljana Spoljaric-Egger about the long-term implications on the conflict on wheat production.
The long-term implications will be that we will have to do everything as of today to join forces with the humanitarians to preserve the functioning and the production lines coming out of Ukraine. So what we have to do as of today, we have to look at the development gain, and we have to work with the government so to ensure that the Ukraine economy continues to subsist and continues to function for the people of Ukraine, but also for other regions in the world. So our investments go to working with the local municipalities in sustaining the provision of public services, in sustaining agriculture, and the people are willing to do that and are willing to work together.
Is that even possible in a place like Mariupol or Kherson or Kharkiv?
It is not possible in Mariupol, of course, and this city will depend on emergency assistance. But there are large parts in the country, including in the West, that we have to preserve economically and will have to use to kickstart the economy again as quickly as possible when we can achieve a hard environment.
Miljana, I'm just going to play this clip because you, of course, have been elected as the next president of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And the current president, Peter Mora, who has been in Moscow today, has said the following. He met with Foreign Minister Lavrov at a press conference, and this is what he had to say. Just have a listen.
I'm certainly committed with the ICRC to have as objective as possible and as fact and evidence-based as possible decisions. We know that this is always a challenge and the difficulties in conflict. I do respect also that after my visit in Kiev and here, there are always different interpretations of international law.
That's Peter Mora. You heard there that clip. I mean, he's talking about the different interpretations of international law, but the targeting of maternity hospitals in Mariupol, of theatres where we know that women and children are seeking shelter, is that open to interpretation?
The targeting of hospitals and civilian infrastructure is not open to interpretation. It creates senseless suffering, and it is a direct attack on the livelihood and the economic basis of a country, which we have to prevent.
So, if you were meeting with Sergei Lavrov in your, in your next position as president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, you would vehemently disagree with Peter Maurer.
I don't think I will ever disagree with Peter Maurer, because neither Peter nor I will ever seek for justification for attacks on civilian infrastructure, especially hospitals and schools.
So when he says, though, that it's different interpretations of international law, what do you think he's referring to?
The international law can be interpreted differently by other parties, but it is clear in the sense of not allowing attacks on civilian infrastructure.
That was Mariana Egger, the Deputy UN Secretary-General, speaking to me there a little earlier. Let's just take you to the NATO summit in Brussels, where German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is currently speaking to the press. He has continued to discuss the conflict in Ukraine, and he says that we call on the Russian president to agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine and establish a humanitarian corridors in some of the worst affected areas like Mariupol. He's also said that we are more united in this difficult situation than ever before, and he also spoke about the situation with refugees, saying we are obliged to take those people who are fleeing the country. Matthew will be back with all the latest headlines on Ukraine and other news. Goodbye for now.
Hello there. Let's take a look at some of the bigger weather stories going on across the globe. Starting with North America, we've had this troublesome front which has brought tornadic thunderstorms to parts of the deep south over the last couple of days. That is slipping its way southwards and eastwards all the while. Still be a bit of a hang back though across the eastern seaboard, certainly down Georgia into Florida on Thursday. Some heavy rainfall here, snow on its northern edge, with some cold air across central and eastern Canada, and there'll be further snow through central Canada there. This cold air will be diving southwards and eastwards into much of the eastern United States as we head on into the weekend. But it's a different story across the west, particularly the southwest. Here we're looking at temperatures well above the seasonal norm. Some even record challenging late March heat expected there over the next few days. So that weather front will be pushing into southern Mexico and parts of the Caribbean Thursday and Friday. So some heavy showers here. That will clear away, so we should see an improvement during the course of the weekend. Very heavy rainfall has been affecting the southeast corner of South America. We've had reports of flooding in Paraguay. This vigorous flow will slowly clear away from the northeast of Argentina on Thursday, taking the heavy rain and the gales with it. It also stays very wet across Iberia, southern eastern Spain, seeing further heavy flooding rainfall on Friday. Slow improvement across the southeast. We're looking at temperatures getting closer back to the seasonal norm across Greece and the islands. High pressure dominates the scene, though, across much of Central and Northern Europe. Lots of sunshine here. So it's cool and wetter than average across the northwest of Africa, thanks to that area of low pressure. Cooler as well for Libya and for Egypt. Plenty of downpours across the southern quarter of the continent and into Madagascar. This area of low pressure bringing further cool weather into the Levant, across into the Caucasus, some heavy rainfall there, mountain snow, but the rest of the Middle East for Friday will be dry with a good deal of sunshine around temperatures around the seasonal norm. Much of South Asia is dry as well to end the week. Still that risk of some heavy showers across the south and the west, certainly around the Western Ghats. Those temperatures creeping close to the 40 Celsius mark, though, across central and northern India. Looks pretty unsettled, though, to end the week across southern and eastern China. This intense area of low pressure will be pushing its way eastwards, bringing a spell of gales as well, that pushing into the Korean Peninsula and southern Japan as we head into the start of the weekend. So some very wet weather there for a while through Friday, but it will be quite warm, that air coming in from the south, so quite warm and humid. Indochina will be largely dry with some sunshine, but there will be some intense downpours around. We've got the usual mixture of sunshine and afternoon downpours across Indonesia and Malaysia. Finally, for Australasia, well, some heavy downpours across Australia's northern territory, dry, sunny and hot across the west. Fortunately, we're looking at more showers and heavy rain pushing into New South Wales and southern Queensland, areas that really don't need any more rainfall. So it looks quite wet here through Friday and the weekend, and a slow improvement across New Zealand's North Island.
Hello, I'm Ross Atkins with Outside Source. This is the extraordinary story of climate change. Vaccines, Europe, the Taliban, China. There is an awful lot to consider. Let's take this stage by stage. Here's the BBC's Stephen McDonald in Beijing. So help me understand the politics of this. Let's look at some of the international reaction. Tell us what you've been hearing. In practical terms, what does that mean? Next, we have to step back and let's just remind ourselves this is all part of the same story.
Piece the story together with Ross Atkins. Outside Source on BBC World News.
This is BBC News. I'm Matthew Amrediwala. 1 month on from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Another setback for Moscow as the Ukrainian Navy destroys a landing ship west of Mariupol. Ukraine accuses Russian forces of forcibly deporting 15,000 residents of Mariupol to Russia from the districts they've captured.
And I'm Lise Doucette in Kyiv, where President Zelensky speaks of a month of heroic resistance and a month of dark suffering.
NATO leaders approve plans to send 40,000 extra troops to their eastern border. They call it the biggest security crisis in a generation. More than 3.5 million people have now fled Ukraine, with more than 2 million crossing into Poland.
Get it down!
In other news, here in Britain, a jury at the Old Bailey has shown footage of the moment the man accused of murdering the MP, Sir David Amess, was tackled by police. He denies murder. And the boss of P&O Ferries has admitted breaking the law by sacking 800 workers without consulting the unions. Hello and welcome to BBC News. It is exactly a month since Russian troops invaded Ukraine. Since then, thousands of civilians, Ukrainian soldiers and Russian troops have been killed. Some cities, like Mariupol, have faced a relentless Russian bombardment and suffered almost complete destruction. President Zelensky has called it a terrible, dark month of destruction and urged people around the world to come out and protest against the invasion. President Putin has never called it a war, but rather a special operation to demilitarize his neighbour. Well, in Brussels, it is a day of crucial diplomacy. President Biden has joined Western leaders with a flurry of meetings of NATO, the G7 and EU Council. And in the last few moments, the G7 leaders have warned Russia not to use biological or chemical weapons in Ukraine. Well, we're live with our correspondent Lise Doucette in Kyiv. Also in a moment, Jessica Parker in Brussels. But let's head to Kyiv, the capital, and to Lise. And Lise, you said on the first day of this war, it felt like everything was turned upside down, inside out. We're now a month in. What are your reflections?
Every life in this country, and indeed far beyond, has been upended by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It has been a month like no other for this country and for countries beyond its borders. President Zelensky has described it as a month of heroic resistance, but also of dark suffering. How can we forget that a month ago at this time, there was dread that it was just a matter of time, even possibly a matter of days, before Russian forces already heading here from the Belarusian border would be in the capital within days. And an airport just west of here, Hostomel Airport, had already been attacked and captured by Russian forces. And where is Ukraine now? Well, that Hostomel airport is still contested, and Russia still hasn't seized a major city, a city of symbolic and strategic value. And not only are the Ukrainians holding ground, they're also going on the offensive. They've taken back Kharkiv, right on the border with the capital Kyiv. They're also taking back territory in the south. But Russia continues to attack. Look at Mariupol, now described as hell on earth, and it's not the only place. So 1 month on, this is still a place where Russia continues its offensive, and the Ukrainians continue their attacks too. Let's look at all the latest developments with this report from Celestina Olulude.
Pictures from a Ukrainian source appearing to show a strike on a Russian naval ship in the occupied port of Berdyansk. Plumes of smoke are seen billowing from the large vessel. If confirmed, this would be a setback to Russia's attempts to create a land bridge in the southeast of Ukraine. Seen here 3 days ago, the ship was capable of carrying up to 1,500 tons of military equipment. The attack took place 80 kilometres from the besieged port city of Mariupol. Once vibrant, these are the scars of a month of war. Russian bombardment leaving ruins and rubble throughout. Standing defiant, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, last night, unusually in English, urged people worldwide to show their support for Ukraine.
This is only the beginning for Russia on the Ukrainian land. Show your standing. Come from your offices, your homes, your schools and universities. Come in the name of peace. Come with Ukrainian symbols to support Ukraine, to support freedom, to support life. Come to your squares, your streets. Make yourselves visible and heard. Say that people matter, freedom matters, peace matters, Ukraine matters.
A significant amount of strategic territory has been taken by Russia, but the capital Kyiv remains in Ukrainian hands, with troops taking back some surrounding areas. Britain will provide 6,000 missiles and £25 million to support the Ukrainian army. But as the war continues into a second month, Ukraine's demands for a no-fly zone are yet to be met. Celestina Olulude, BBC News.
And so another day where President Zelensky has been expressing gratitude for all of the military, humanitarian, political, every kind of support being offered by his neighbours and from many capitals beyond. But another day where he says it's simply not enough. Not enough for a war which still grinds on, a war of attrition. It's now being called, with such a deep sense of foreboding that as bad as it has been, the worst could still be to come.
Lise, we've heard very little in this last week of anything surrounding peace talks. What's your reading of that?
Yes, it's very interesting that almost as soon as this invasion started, the discussions started between Ukrainian and Russian negotiators. And we have been hearing all along that they have been making progress, not just by the negotiating teams, but also by the many mediators who are very keen to be able to say that they are the ones who got President Zelensky and President Putin together to end this war of our time. But I think now, 1 month on, there is a recognition that while some progress has been made, the talks are described as more realistic. President Putin apparently doesn't call again for that horrible word, decapitating the Ukrainian government, the removal of President Zelensky and his team. He doesn't call for the removal of the Ukrainian military. And similarly, Ukraine has understood that it's not going to join NATO anytime soon, if at all. But the issues of territory, of what Russia still wants and wants to keep, remain the most contentious issues of all. The mediators say President Putin will meet President Zelensky when the time is right, but 1 month on, it does seem the time isn't right yet.
Lisa, you were talking about President Zelensky. He has called for protest around the world to mark this 1 month moment. But in terms of help, he's been very specific in what he wants from all those meetings going on in Brussels, and particularly around weapons.
Yes, he's always very clever in his choice of words. Either he or his staff does the research. Every time he addresses a foreign parliament, he touches on the history of the country in question, draws on their most evocative moments, and then asks them to think about Ukraine. Today, in addressing the NATO military alliance, he looked carefully at what kind of weaponry they had, and he said, just give us 1% of your combat aircraft, 1% of your tanks. He said, give us 500 tanks. You've got some 20,000. And so you can see the faces of the NATO leaders sitting there and knowing that, of course, Ukraine is fighting a war for them on their borders, and NATO saying time and again that they will not go beyond the borders of NATO members' territory. But there has been a consistent support and a supply. We don't know all the details. We weren't privy to the discussions today. Jens Stoltenberg said they couldn't reveal, but they are talking about air defense systems, while saying no to a no-fly zone. They are talking about continuing that supply of weapons, and no doubt President Putin and his officers have a close eye on those supply links as well, those supply lines, knowing full well that they are the key to the Ukrainian resistance on the ground and in the air.
Lisa said live there in Kyiv. Thanks very much for the latest, and Lisa taking us to exactly where we're going next, because the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has said that Vladimir Putin made a big mistake by invading Ukraine and has underestimated the strength and bravery of the Ukrainian people. President Biden has joined Boris Johnson and other NATO leaders in Brussels for an emergency summit today to try to find solutions. Well, here's NATO Secretary General laying out further support that the alliance will provide to Ukraine.
On land, we will have substantially more forces in the eastern part of the alliance at higher readiness, with more pre-positioned equipment and supplies. In the air, we will deploy more jets and strengthen our integrated air and missile defense. At sea, we will have carrier strike groups, submarines, and significant numbers of combat ships on a persistent basis. We will also strengthen our cyber defenses and enhance our exercises, focusing on collective defense and interoperability.
That was Jens Stoltenberg a few moments ago. Let me show you the live pictures from that meeting, because Emmanuel Macron currently at the microphone, so just making his comments. We heard from the German Chancellor only a few moments ago, so we'll keep across that feed that is coming into the BBC, and anything significant from the French President, we will return to it. But watching all of this for us in Brussels is our correspondent Jessica Parker. And Jessica, a whole flurry of meetings over the next few hours. What are you expecting?
Yes, so the G7 we think has just wrapped up. That was after the NATO summit, and now the European Council summit. So that's EU leaders gathering here, as they often do. But this meeting has a difference. President Biden, we expect, is going to walk up this red carpet fairly shortly. You can maybe see there's flags there, US and EU flags, as the backdrop for the president. First time a US president, we're told, has attended a European Council here in Brussels. And of course, part of all of this is to show unity in the West, to try and demonstrate to Ukraine that they're behind Ukraine's efforts to fight Russia, and as well talking about how to impose sanctions, make sure there aren't any loopholes, talk as well about possible future sanctions. But a really key topic as well, I think, between the EU and America is that of energy. Liquefied natural gas can help Europe wean itself off Russia's gas supply, because the great concern is that Europe is effectively filling Putin's war coffers by buying so much Russian energy.
Yes, as you speak, we can see Ursula von der Leyen arrive. Joe Biden bringing something to the table exactly on that pretty contentious issue of energy within the Allies.
Yeah, I mean, it is a contentious issue because it's a contentious issue, to be honest with you, within the EU. So there are some member states who are so concerned about the amount of money being sent to Russia to pay for gas, oil and coal that they want to see really swift action in terms of potentially an energy embargo. Latvia's Prime Minister, arriving this afternoon, said he would be pushing efforts this afternoon at tonight's meetings, particularly on oil and coal, which Europe's slightly less reliant on than in terms of Russian gas. But there are other countries, notably Germany, for example, who are saying you cannot just switch off Russian energy supplies overnight. Olaf Scholz has warned very publicly this week he thinks it could lead to a European recession. And the argument, I think, from their perspective is that why weaken Europe when Europe needs to be strong? So I think a big question here is to what extent America can step in and fill some of that gap to help the EU wean itself off Russian gas sooner rather than later, because there is unity in the terms of the need to do that. It's really just a question of how fast.
All right, Jessica, for now, thanks very much. Perhaps we'll get some of those answers in the next couple of hours. Jessica Parker, live for us there in Brussels. Well, more than 3.5 million people have now fled Ukraine, with more than 2 million of them crossing into Poland, although the numbers have been decreasing in recent days. Well, our correspondent Mark Lowen has been there since the first day and sent this report from the border.
It's been a month of lives ripped up, a generation driven out, certainty torn apart. A month that we've been here, seeing the heartbreak of the sick forced to flee, but compassion too of hearts and homes opened, of the democratic world standing up to the aggressor. 4 weeks on, the only change is warmer weather. The arrivals keep coming, seeking safety from a war some don't understand, welcomed where Poland can put them. This a school, a smile for the kids at the ready. Inside, volunteers bring comfort after an exhausting journey. Yulia Kirienko and her sons fled Kiev, her husband staying to fight.
Children were killed and teenage girls were raped. We had to leave. They were shooting at the cars as we tried to escape. We prayed as we drove. It's good here, but we want to go home. I just want this to end.
The trauma on the youngest could take years to show and last a lifetime. Olga Oleshko's little ones already feel it.
They were asking why helicopters were flying, why there were sirens, why people were dying. I had to explain it in a way that didn't hurt them.
At the start of the invasion, we watched as panic prompted the immediate first rush to escape. But these are the people who didn't want to leave, thinking they could stick it out, that the bombs might stop. But they didn't stop, and more than 3.5 million refugees later, there's a growing feeling of the long term about this, with all the challenges that that will entail. Destination Warsaw, whose population is up by almost a fifth. New arrivals given ID numbers and school places. They have a journey to safety, but their country still has no passage to peace. Mark Lowen, BBC News, on the Poland-Ukraine border.
Well, as we enter the second month of this war, let's just take stock of where we are when it comes to strategy. Just in the last few seconds, the Ukrainian presidential advisor has been speaking to Reuters, saying the situation on the front line is, quote, practically frozen. He then goes on to say many Russian forces don't have the resources for an offensive. So that the latest assessment from Ukraine's presidential advisor. Let's hear the assessment from our security correspondent, Frank Gardner.
So just why has it gone so badly for Russia in these first few weeks of the war? Well, there are a number of reasons. There is the strength of Ukrainian resistance. Most of the population has rallied round their government. The troops are using Western-supplied weapons like Javelin and Stinger missiles. And when it comes to getting inside big cities, Russia doesn't have enough troops to take on the defenders in most cases. Here's their charismatic president, Volodymyr Zelensky, a one-time comic actor who's rallied the nation, refusing to leave the capital, even though there's a bounty on his head. Then there's poor Russian tactics. Russian commanders on the ground have largely failed to take full advantage of all the tools at their disposal. Things like armoured vehicles, artillery, rocket launchers, helicopters, all of which, when combined with infantry, can have a massive effect, but which the Russians have failed to master. The Russian Air Force is 15 times bigger than Ukraine's, yet they've failed to achieve supremacy in the skies. And finally, there's poor Russian logistics and communications. Russian soldiers have not always maintained their vehicles properly, meaning that many of them are breaking down. And when it comes to radios, a lot of them don't work, forcing them to use mobile phones, which can easily be intercepted by the Ukrainians. Many of the Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine thought they were just going on exercise, like this one in Belarus. That didn't give them enough time to prepare for battle.
Exercises never prepared troops properly for combat, so that they were not combat ready. And that puts real strain on the non-commissioned officers, the sergeants and the corporals, to get things ready in time, make sure the troops do their job properly. And in the Russian army, the sergeants and the corporals are renowned for their inefficiency, their corruption, and the bad relationships they have with the soldiers. So everything that could go wrong, more or less, did go wrong.
And today, a small victory for Ukraine on the Sea of Azov. Its forces claim to have destroyed a Russian amphibious landing ship. Russia still has plenty more ships, but the fact Ukrainians are still fighting back 1 month on shows Russia has grossly underestimated them. Frank Gardner, BBC News.
Well, Frank, with that assessment, let's get the view, though, from Moscow. Our correspondent Caroline Davis gave us the view from the Kremlin's perspective.
There is no suggestion that the authorities are apologetic or have changed their view on this at all, and that is in the face of unprecedented sanctions, of runs on their foreign currency reserves, of international companies leaving Russia from IT through to McDonald's. And while the rest of the world cuts Russia off, the Kremlin is cutting off anyone that disagrees with it. We've seen media outlets here closed, we've seen social media channels like Facebook and Instagram blocked, thousands of people arrested for protesting. And if you're to turn on any state media or listen to any state official, you will hear the same lines again, that Russia is right, that Russia brings peace, that Ukraine is the one to blame, regardless of what the rest of the world thinks, regardless of the images that we see coming out of Ukraine. Divert, deflect, deny. The Kremlin has doubled down on its stance here, and as a result, Russia is a different and far more isolated place.
Caroline Davis there in Moscow. We'll have plenty more from Ukraine in here just in a moment or two. The latest from Brussels, all those meetings going on. But I just want to turn away from that for a moment or two. One more major story, because a jury has been shown video of the moment a man accused of murdering the British MP Sir David Amess was tackled by police. Ali Harbi Ali allegedly stabbed Mr Amess more than 20 times in an attack in his constituency. Ali from Kentish Town in North London denies murder and preparing terrorist acts. Well, let's go live to the Old Bailey in London, where the trial continues. Our correspondent Daniel Sanford is there for us. And Daniel, take me through the videos that the jury has been shown.
Yes, Matthew, it was the 15th of October last year when Sir David Amess was stabbed in a church in Leigh-on-Sea in his constituency of Southend West. He'd been in the vestry of the church meeting constituents when he was stabbed, and very quickly his assistants dialed 999. The first two police officers to arrive were PC Ryan Curtis and PC Scott James, and they were essentially unarmed. They didn't have guns, they didn't have tasers, they just had batons and some parva spray or pepper spray. And what you're about to see was filmed from the body-worn video of PC Scott James, and I should warn you, it is quite distressing.
Yes, we're TA, we're waiting. We're taser unit. We need the taser unit here. We're TA.
They say he's got a knife and he's just stabbed someone.
He's got a knife, but he's allowing you to go in and see the
Mate, we've got to stick our instructions as well at the same time. We've got a taser unit 1 minute away, so we're going to go in and stick a taser.
Stand at the door. He's not right there. You can go and stand at the door.
Can you show us, mate? Stay back there.
That's all right.
Here on the left.
You can go and stand at this door. Yeah, go on. You can see what's names. You stand at the side. Yeah?
Mate, drop the knife. Drop the knife down! Mate, drop that knife! Drop that knife! Drop the knife down! Mate, drop the knife! You can drop it! Mate, listen to me. Drop the knife. Mate, drop no, it's... Mate, drop the knife! Drop the knife! Mate, you can drop the Listen to me. Look, it's only going to go one way. Just drop that knife. Please drop that knife for me. Just drop the knife.
We'll talk about it.
You don't want to do this. Okay?
Mate, just drop the knife.
You can do this.
Mate, taser.
Get up, mate. Yeah, come on. On the floor now. On the floor.
Get it down. We got him. Right, search him.
Right, mate, at the moment you're under arrest for murder, alright? If you'd like to say anything, you may arm your defence if you do not mention...
This male has stabbed... What's the man's name?
David Amos.
David Amos.
A-M-E-S-S.
Yeah.
And caused him to be deceased.
Domestic or hate related in any
Terror.
way? Pardon?
Terror. I'd say hate, yeah.
On what basis? Racial, religious?
Religious.
And as well as that arrest video, the jury have also been watching CCTV images of Ali Harbi Ali in Westminster and also looking through phone records showing that he was several times outside Michael Gove's house in West London in the months before this attack was carried out. What the prosecution say was that he was preparing a terrorist act, reconnoitring various places where he might attack MPs before settling on trying to attack Sir David Amos. He actually denies murder and also denies preparing terrorist acts. The trial continues, Matthew.
Daniel Sanford there at the Old Bailey. Thanks very much. Thank you. Well, before we take a break, let me just return to Ukraine. Those meetings currently going on in Brussels. Emmanuel Macron just at the microphones in the last few moments. He's been saying that the sanctions that have been imposed have an impact. They are tangible and we must continue with them. Let me also put onto the screen some of the latest pictures from Mariupol, that strategic city in the south. Some of the latest pictures from the last couple of days that have just come into the BBC, and at ground level you see just the extraordinary extent of the destruction. Between 80 and 90% of this city has been destroyed, and the authorities, Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister, again complaining today that Russian forces are preventing civilians from leaving Mariupol. 100,000 people still in that city without food, water or power. As I say, I'm back with all the latest. I'm here with John Simpson here in just a moment or two. Don't go away.
When you know something important is happening, you want to be in there, to be part of it. At FT Live events, new ideas and valuable insights are shared by the world's leading minds, online and in person. Make sure you're there with them to shape the agenda with the right people in the right place at the right time.
Hello there. We've got two distinct areas of low pressure across the European continent, certainly for the next few days. The most intense one is continuing to affect Iberia and northwest Africa. This one is clearing away from the eastern Mediterranean, taking the showers and the very cold air with it. Elsewhere, it's a huge area of high pressure, which has been bringing fine, dry and settled conditions with generally light winds, especially so across the northwest of the continent. But some low pressure will be extending southwards across Scandinavia through Friday into the weekend. Still quite cold across the eastern Med, the Levant for Cyprus there, but temperatures finally recovered across much of Greece and the islands with some good spells of sunshine. Those temperatures closer to what we expect in this time of year. Italy, Sicily, dry with some sunshine, some very wet weather, again affecting southern and eastern Spain in particular, where we've seen some flooding of late. But it is good news to see rain here, as we've had drought conditions for quite a while across much of Iberia. For Saturday then, we see further heavy downpours across eastern Spain, the Balearics. It stays fine and dry across the southeast with increasing amounts of sunshine, but some snowy weather will extend southwards across Scandinavia into the Baltic states. For Rome, it's a fine, dry and sunny outlook for the next 5 days. In fact, for London and for Paris, it'll be warm in the short term and then turn cooler into the next week. And for Athens, those temperatures remain closer to the seasonal norm for the next few days.
This is the Russian attack playbook, perfected in over 10 years of war in Syria.
Tonight, it was far noisier, much louder, more constant, like rolling thunder for a very long time.
Remember, it was Russia that launched this offensive, sending its troops across the border into a sovereign nation.
If Vladimir Putin expected his troops to be met here as liberators, then signs like this all along the roads here are sending a very different message.
We break stories from more places than any other international news broadcaster. We are the leaders in global breaking news.
Ethiopia's civil war is marked by abuses against the defenseless. Thousands have died and millions are in need of aid. 15 months on, there is still a long way to go to find an end to the bloodshed. Join me, Kalkidan Ibeltal, on BBC World News as I report on the impacts of the war from northern Ethiopia.
If you've got questions about the stories making headlines, Reality Check is here to help you get the facts straight. Our team of experts examine the evidence and cut through the spin. Join me, Chris Morris, here on BBC World News, or go to bbc.com/Reality Check.
Fire away, please, your question.
Still bringing people together.
Our audience members join us from Cambodia, France, Indonesia, Liberia.
Still asking questions.
Will bigger government intervention in the economy be the norm?
Still getting answers.
We never had such an experience in our lives.
I actually disagree.
I'm quite worried.
Your voice?
This is going to be a collective idea.
Still heard. Global Questions, this weekend on BBC World News.
Welcome back to BBC News. It is a month since Russian troops invaded Ukraine, a shocking, devastating month with no end in sight. Thousands of civilians, Ukrainian soldiers and Russian troops have been killed. Some cities, like Mariupol, have faced a relentless Russian bombardment and suffered almost complete destruction. Well, going on also today in Brussels, a day of crucial diplomacy. President Biden joining Western leaders with all of those meetings going on of NATO, of the G7 and the EU Council. Well, let's talk to our World Affairs editor, John Simpson, who joins me again to take stock of where we are. And John, your headline thoughts a month into this war?
I would say that it's been an extraordinarily successful time for the Ukrainian army and the armed forces. They've done wonders, but do not think that the war is over. The war will only be over when Vladimir Putin says it's over. And essentially a dictator now, that's what he's virtually become in Russia. He cannot be seen to lose a war. He can't go back to his people and say, look, I'm sorry, this was a bit of a mistake. We didn't do as well as we thought, so we're going to stop. The only way in which he can go back to the Russian people is to say, we've won this extraordinary victory. We've destroyed the neo-Nazis. We've given you back territory that you really should have had all the time, and what a fantastic success this is. So, all the time you're getting really encouraging stories about the extraordinary defense that the Ukrainian forces are putting up. I mean, the destruction of the ship today, a major success in every way, and the morale of Russian soldiers is clearly very low, but this can only end really when Putin says it's going to end.
I'll come back to that thought about Vladimir Putin in a moment as we see those pictures from the Ukrainian Navy's strike on this Russian vessel that you were talking about. Interesting, in the last few moments, the presidential advisor for Ukraine's president saying the front lines in their assessment have become almost frozen despite being 4 weeks into this campaign. I want to talk about that NATO meeting that is going on and the flurry of meetings in Brussels, because only a few weeks ago, the German Chancellor used that word Zeitenwende, which means turning point. And that was at the moment that Germany changed their fundamental policy on foreign policy, on military spending. In a sense, NATO facing exactly the same issues as all of those leaders meet.
Yes, and Germany's change, that Zeitenwende, it is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, it's beyond the abilities of US president after US president to persuade German chancellors to do it. And in an instant, it was done. The agreement was made to increase German defense spending. Every single country in NATO is going to have to increase its defense spending as a result of this attack in Ukraine. And that's partly what's going to be discussed privately, quietly in the margins of this NATO summit, which is also, of course, being held in parallel with an EU meeting and a G7 meeting. So all the Western powers really essentially are there, but every one of them knows that the days of low defense spending are finished.
John, let's turn to Mariupol. Of course, such devastation in that city. I just want to put onto the screen some of the latest pictures, because pictures coming into the BBC at ground level. We've seen quite a lot of drone pictures over the last few days which show the extraordinary amount of devastation. But at ground level, you really see the enormity of the damage done, this relentless bombardment of this southern port city. And John, reports again, and they've been circulating for a couple of days, with Ukraine accusing Russia of forcibly taking up to 15,000 people from Mariupol, the districts they've taken, to...
Well, I think it's part of a kind of collective punishment that Russia is imposing on Ukraine, taking its people away. I've looked into this a bit. I mean, it really... Of course, you're always in the hands of the people you speak to, but the evidence for this does seem to be pretty strong, that people are being taken out and held, no doubt, as hostages at some stage, part of whatever final agreement, well, hopefully part of whatever final agreement is reached. But the way that Mariupol has been treated is really goes directly back to Russia's experience in Syria, where it got away with destroying city after city, town after town, in this kind of brutal way. And you do wonder really what's in the mind of President Putin, what he thinks the Western powers will put up with if they put up with the kind of, as it were, Syrian treatment. And he must now realize that they're not going to put up with it nearly as easily as he thought.
Yes, it's been interesting, the absence of actually seeing any of those defence officials or military advisors on our screens. It has simply been dominated by Vladimir Putin. And just a final question about what Jens Stoltenberg was saying a little earlier, again warning Russia not to use chemical weapons. We've seen a whole series of warnings from the G7, from President Biden repeatedly. I spoke yesterday to the UN ambassador, the UK's UN ambassador, and she was saying perhaps today was the time for clear red lines to be actually laid out, not just about saying you can't use them, but the consequences of what would happen if they were used. Do you think that is likely?
I think it must be a possibility, but I mean the fact is, Matthew, that NATO is in this with one arm tied behind its back, and an unnamed official, but clearly somebody pretty senior in the NATO hierarchy, came out today at that meeting and said that actually the use of chemical weapons inside Ukraine against Ukrainian people is not a red line for NATO. That's to say, if the Russians do use that, NATO will not use it as an excuse to move in and take on Russian troops. And the Russians will have noticed that. They'll know that they can, if they wanted to, get away with using chemical weapons. The one thing they won't be able to get away with is if the effects of those chemical weapons drifts across into NATO territory in one area or another, Poland perhaps, or something like that. That NATO would consider an absolute red line, an attack on NATO territory. But if it's done within Ukraine, it looks as though NATO will look on at that and just have to put up with it.
Well, that's a very bleak assessment if that's how it pans out. A final thought, and we come full circle a month into this campaign, John, because the impact of it, I mean, the ripples, just the shockwaves being felt in every capital. Yes,
I mean, quite extraordinary. And, you know, in the Far East, in India, in Britain with the Chelsea Football Club. I mean, I can't think of a crisis, an international crisis, which has had this extraordinary ripple effect and changed the lives and the way that countries work, really. I mean, like Germany, suddenly being prepared to stand up and spend the money that's necessary on its own defense. But right across the world, we're going to be feeling the effects of this for a very, very long time.
John, there we have to leave it. John Simpson, thanks very much for your assessment of what we've gone through over the first 4 weeks of this invasion. John Simpson there. Let's get more insight now on President Putin's strategy, because I'm joined now by Nina Khrushcheva, an expert Russian and Eastern European affairs. She's also the great-granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev, who led the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. She joins me, as you can see, live from New York, and it's a pleasure to have you here on the programme. A lot of people hoped that the military build-up was just a negotiating tactic. How surprised were you that Putin went ahead and invaded?
Well, I was one of those people who argued repeatedly that Russia is a grand country, it's a big country, so its negotiation tactics are also very grand and scary. So I was in shock when it did happen, because it seems completely irrational. I mean, and we see it's a month into this war, and it's completely irrational. It goes against every single national interest there is. It goes against all the goals that Putin stated, that we want a new security negotiations in Europe. We want collective security. We want NATO to be less threatening to Russia, not more. And what's remarkable, that he achieved just absolutely the opposite. In fact, NATO countries are meeting in Brussels, and there's a certain amount of unity that probably they haven't seen since the war in Iraq or even war in Afghanistan since early 2000s, when all those American wars were
Yes.
declared. So he achieved just the opposite.
You said in a recent article you felt shame at this invasion. Why, given that this is straight out of the Kremlin, straight out of one man?
Well, I mean, I'm a Russian. I'm responsible for my nation. I mean, that's what essentially we all talk about when we talk about democracies. That's what you go and protest. That's why you express your opinion. That's why there is a freedom of speech in normal countries, because you are responsible for the actions of your nation. Also, you know, you mentioned Nikita Khrushchev, and he had his own share of bad behavior, sort of Soviet oppressive behavior. And I do feel responsible for that too, because I try to be a good citizen. So yes, I am ashamed. And I think a lot of Russians, in fact, you know that, I'm sure you've reported on, I know you've reported on this, at least 300,000 Russians left because they feel responsible, they feel ashamed, they feel that they can speak freely from elsewhere, because in Russia now you cannot make a peep if it's not in agreement with the Kremlin or not in agreement with the Ministry of Defense.
Yes, we're seeing as you speak pictures of your great-grandfather, and you've written about, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you say that, of course, Khrushchev was a major participant in that, but you then go on to say you think that if you're going to push and your opponent is going to blink, then you push and your opponent doesn't blink. What do you do then? So what is the way out of this, do you think?
Well, I think, I mean, it was a nice comparison with the Cuban Missile Crisis when there were negotiations for 3 months. But I think we're way past that. I mean, you know, Khrushchev was dubbed as a very impulsive politician, a politician who would get to the brink of confrontation, but then back off, as he did with the Cuban Missile Crisis, because when he realized that even the smallest mistake can bring a horrible disaster for the world, he and Kennedy really quickly wrapped it up. It only took 13 days. So, but comparing with the impulsive Khrushchev, I mean, Putin does seem, I mean, Khrushchev now seems very zen comparing to what Putin has done in Ukraine. Very frightening, because it does seem that Putin is ready to go as far as he needs to go to prove a point that Russia is a great country and he's Putin the first, the great new to be operative. But I think what he does now really just shows that absolute power corrupts absolutely. That after it was COVID syndrome, obviously, when he was completely hidden from the world for 2 years, you finally suddenly come out and just the map of geopolitics that I think in Putin's head is completely different from what geopolitics is. And therefore, of course, when I met him in 2000, he was still much more connected to the world. But now, after 22 years in power, he's not connected.
Sanctions that anybody can really remember. Can Vladimir Putin insulate himself from all of that and the impacts of all of that?
He does, and he has, and he will. And that's why I think that those sanctions, and essentially it's economic weapons of mass destruction, of course, people will feel them. This is the people that are going to suffer. It's not the have enough resources for them to continue live on the way they have. Well, now they're not going to travel abroad, but still, it's the Russian people who are going to suffer. And that's when the collective punishment comes in. And that's why I think the Russian future is so or one day it will be, again, a repetition of 1991 when people rise up and go to the streets and refuse to take it. But that would be a horrific bloodshed then. And so I am very, very concerned and traumatized by the tragic future of my country.
Nina Shkusheva, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us here live on BBC News. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, we're talking there at the end of that interview about sanctions. We are expecting more sanctions, both from the EU, the G7 and President Biden in those meetings currently going on in Brussels. Sam Simmons is here with a look at that and the rest of the business news in terms of how they tighten the screw.
Yeah, we're going to find out more about that. Matthew, thank you. Well, yes, President Biden is in Europe taking part in those emergency summits, the NATO summit, the G7 summit, and of course that meeting of the European Council in Brussels. A key part of their discussion, sanctions. Let's talk to my colleague Michelle Fleury, who is in New York for us. Hi, Michelle. What's the latest on the sanctions?
Well, earlier today we heard from the United States basically unveiling their latest raft of sanctions. These include Russian elites, the CEO of Sberbank, a giant Russian bank, as well as various members related to defense companies and members of the Russian Duma, the country's parliament. All of this trying to ratchet up economic pressure on this company. There was also a move to try and restrict Russia's ability to use its massive gold reserves as a way to kind of circumvent some of the sanctions already in place, which has made it very difficult for the country's currency to sort of maintain its value. The central bank has been acting to kind of try and prop it up, and they're trying to remove sort of one of its abilities to do that with these sanctions. Interestingly, we heard from the German Chancellor Scholz basically saying he supported these measures and that they were prepared to go further if necessary. Of course, as we know, one of the kind of key stumbling blocks has been Europe's dependence on natural gas from Russia. It gets about 40% of its supply there. So that has been sort of one area where, if you like, they've had to hold back some of perhaps their strongest economic weapons. Interestingly, Russia responded by saying that they would start to demand payment for natural gas in rubles. That drew a response from Italy's Prime Minister Mario Draghi, basically saying that that would violate the contract which currently exists between Europe and Russia.
And Michelle, one other story to ask you about, and that's the famous yellow cabs that are seen all over New York City there. Part of its DNA. There's going to be a bit of a change into how you can hail one from now on.
Yeah, I mean, customers are going to be able to hail them through the ride-hailing app Uber. And, you know, like many major cities around the world, the arrival of Uber has caused quite a lot of financial heartache for New York's famed yellow cabs. Ridership is massively down since their arrival in the city. So the idea now that there would be some sort of sharing of technology for this kind of ride-hailership has caught many people off guard. Now, what's behind it is, on Uber's side, there's been a shortage of drivers since the pandemic. So that is one way to try and reduce that. That led to customers complaining about higher prices. On the taxi side, the yellow cab drivers, there have been many bankruptcies. About 1,000 or so New York cab drivers have filed for bankruptcy in recent years. So this is a way of sort of trying to help both sides. But here's the thing, Samantha. If you take a taxi, a yellow taxi from the airport here, JFK, there's a fixed fee. If you take an Uber, typically that fee is substantially higher. So how these two sort of match up, given this kind of new system, I think that's the sort of detail people are waiting to hear more about.
All right, Michelle, in New York for now, thank you. The chief executive of P&O Ferries has admitted that the decision to sack 800 workers without consulting unions broke the law. Peter Hebblethwaite said he chose not to consult because he didn't believe there was any other way to do it. He also said he would make the same decision again because the business wasn't viable, rather. And now it is. Speaking to a committee of MPs, Mr Hebblethwaite said the move was the only way to save the company. Mike Lynch from the RMT Rail Union told the same committee that P&O had made flagrant breaches of the law. Here's our business correspondent Theo Leggett.
Arriving to the chair of the Joint Transport and Business Committee set the tone from the outset.
Are you in this mess because you don't know what you're doing, or are you just a shameless criminal?
No answer there, but the P&O boss did admit breaking the law by not consulting with unions.
There's absolutely no doubt that we were required to consult with the unions. We chose not to do that because we believe...
You chose to break the law?
Because we chose not to consult, and we will will compensate everybody in full for that.
The ferry crews were sacked so they could be replaced with cheaper agency workers.
The average hourly rate of pay is £5.50.
That's below the national minimum wage of this country. How do you reconcile that?
Where we are governed by national minimum wage, we will absolutely pay national minimum wage. This is an international seafaring model.
To kill our merchant marine and to kill our employment laws, and something's got to be done about it today. The Prime Minister said he's going to prosecute. This government has got to intervene now, impound these ships and get our people back to work.
Meanwhile, P&O's ferries stand idle. Shows no sign of dying down. Theo Leggett, BBC News.
There's been increasing criticism from some quarters of the UK government's finance chief, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, after he set out measures to ease the impact of soaring energy, food and fuel prices. He's cut fuel duty by 5 pence a litre and raised the threshold at which workers start paying national insurance by almost £3,000. He's also promised an income tax cut in 2024 when he says the economy will be in better shape. But he has resisted calls to scrap a rise in the rate of national insurance due to come in next month. Well, earlier I spoke to Carl Emerson, Deputy Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and started off by asking him why, despite promising tax cuts, almost all people in work will be paying more tax.
Yes, so by 2025, it is true that the Chancellor, as a result of yesterday's statement, will have done some tax cutting. He will have taken people out of national insurance and he will have cut the basic rate of income tax. But he also will have done a whole load of tax rising. In particular, he will have frozen the point at which people start to pay income tax, frozen the point at which people start to pay higher rate income tax, and also increased the rate of national insurance. Now, those freezes in tax points when inflation is so high bite very, very deeply. And what that means is by 2025, the takeaway from the tax rises is much bigger than the giveaway from the tax cuts. And as a result, the vast majority of workers will be paying more tax overall, not less.
Carl Emerson there. Well, that's it from me. Matthew, back to you.
Samantha, a little while we have heard in the last few moments the US announcing another round of sanctions against Russia's lawmakers in response to the invasion of Ukraine. This, the G7 photo that was taken a little earlier in the day. Just a couple of interesting lines to bring you up to date with. Poland's Prime Minister has just said Russia is trying to re-establish an empire of evil. And Emmanuel Macron saying, I want to believe that China will continue to want the war in Ukraine to end. Going on to say, I believe China will do nothing to escalate those meetings, and plenty more from Ukraine, from all of our teams right across the country and on the borders. Coming up for you in just a moment or two. Don't go away.
Some rain affecting the eastern side of the North Island of New Zealand. Also looking very wet across eastern and southeastern China. Some heavy rain continuing here. Showers and storms for Malaysia, Singapore and Indonesia. To South Asia, most places dry. Just a scattering of thunderstorms, 39 degrees there in Nagpur. Some scattered storms across central and southern parts of Africa. Still quite cool up towards the northeast from Cairo down into Khartoum. More rain in the forecast for southern Spain and southern Portugal. Much of the rest of Europe dry, but turning unsettled and cold up towards the far north. Still some wet weather sliding its way northwards across Paraguay and into...
Sorry to lead that straight to Brussels. Boris Johnson has just started speaking.
They flee. The United Kingdom and our allies in NATO and the G7 here today are clear. We will not stand by while Putin vents his fury on Ukraine. I've rarely seen our nations more united in recent years than we are now. Putin's failure in Ukraine is vital for the peace and prosperity of all of us, and his barbaric invasion has galvanized the international community into collective action. We will work with like-minded allies to ramp up lethal aid to Ukraine at scale, providing kit to President Zelensky in the quantity and with the quality that he needs to defend his country from its bullying neighbour. Today, I've announced that we in the UK will send an additional 6,000 missiles and provide £25 million in unrestricted funding for Ukraine's armed forces, more than doubling the lethal aid we've provided to date. We're bolstering our support for the NATO countries on the front line, sending a new deployment of UK troops to Bulgaria on top of doubling our troops both in Poland and in Estonia. This is just the beginning. We must support a free and democratic Ukraine in the long term. This is a fellow European democracy off Russian oil and gas and reshaping global energy security. The UK has already hit over 1,000 Russian individuals and entities in our toughest ever sanctions, and the Foreign Secretary has announced 65 new sanctions against Russian banks, weapons manufacturers, and see huge numbers of Ukrainians flee their homes. And the message that President Putin can take from today's extraordinary meeting of NATO and the G7 is this: Ukraine is not alone. We stand with the people of Kiev, of Mariupol, of Lviv and Donetsk. And as President Zelensky has said himself, the people of Ukraine will prevail, and Putin must fail, and he will fail. Thank you all very much, and I'm going to take a few questions from as many of you as I can, though we have to rush for a plane. Let's go to Nick Beak of the BBC. Nick.
Prime Minister, thanks very much. You say that you're sending to Ukraine. Thank you, Prime Minister. You say that you're sending the quality and quantity of weapons that Ukraine deserves and needs, but it was clear from what President Zelensky was saying to you and other world leaders that he would like more. So first of all, are you comfortable with the level of weapons you're sending collectively? And secondly, how uncomfortable does it make you feel that by rolling out a no-fly zone, by ruling out NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine, and by refusing to give any sort of indication of red lines, that really the only end to this is when President Putin decides he's had enough?
Thanks very much, Nick. And you're right to put your finger on the agony that everybody feels in this group, all Western countries, the whole of NATO, the G7, about our inability to do more to help given the constraints we face. And I think it's fair to say that there isn't a Western democracy that's currently contemplating putting boots on the ground in Ukraine. And we've got to be clear about that. Nor is there a country that is willing to enforce a no-fly zone in the way that we would so like to, but unfortunately it does mean air-to-ground attacks on Russian air defences, and it does mean taking down Russian fast jets and asking the RAF to do that. That's not something that any country here is contemplating. What we are doing is steadily ratcheting up the movement of lethal but defensive weaponry to Ukraine, and that is growing in volume the whole time. And what the Americans are doing and what they have done is really quite extraordinary already, and the UK is proud of what we've contributed. I'll go to Sam Coates of Sky.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Sam Coates of Sky News. President Zelensky, interestingly, didn't repeat his call for a no-fly zone when he addressed NATO leaders. Instead, he was very, very specific. He wants tanks and jets. Are NATO members, is the United Kingdom going to give him tanks and jets? And if not, why not?
Thanks, Sam. He did indeed call for tanks, and there's a particular reason for that. What President Zelensky wants is to try to relieve Mariupol and to help the thousands of Ukrainian fighters in the city. To that end, he does need armour as he sees it. We're looking at what we can do to help, but I've got to tell you, logistically at the moment, it looks very difficult, but both with armour and with jets. We're very conscious of what he's asking for. At the moment, we're looking at the equipment that we think is more immediately valuable is missiles that will enable the Ukrainians to protect themselves against bombardment from the air, but also to deal with the Grad rocket launchers, the Russian heavy artillery. That is doing such death and dealing such death and destruction in the cities. And there, I think, if we can really help them, that would be extremely valuable, because they need protection from that absolutely merciless onslaught from artillery and from the rocket launchers. James Mates, ITV.
Prime Minister, you've also spoken about weaning Europe off Russian oil and gas. There'll be a discussion tonight that you won't be part of at the European Council. Is Europe doing enough? Are the Germans doing enough? What will Britain do to help other countries who rely more on Russian oil and gas to wean themselves off it?
Thanks, James. Look, and I just want to say that this is easier for some countries than it is for others, and everybody can see that. And clearly, the dependency in Germany and in Italy is very strong. And there are many other European countries that depend on Russian gas. But what they're all doing is moving to extricate themselves from that position and to avoid being blackmailed by Vladimir Putin. And I think that what Olaf Scholz has done, the steps that they're taking, I think it's heroic. And I applaud what Germany is doing. They've set themselves deadlines to move away from oil and gas. I don't think it'll be easy. And the Italians are doing the same. I don't think it'll be easy for them. But it's the right thing to do in the long term, in the medium term. And we will help. Of course, and one of the ways that I think we should all work together is in the sharing and the development of alternative provision, not least wind power. I mean, the Baltic countries, for instance, are heavily dependent on gas, but they have a fantastic future as generators of clean renewable energy. We want to help that. We have a lot of experience of it. Jason Groves, Daily Mail.
Thanks, Prime Minister. The Kremlin has named you today as their public enemy #1, saying you're leading the kind of anti-Russian resistance internationally. I wondered why you thought that had happened, whether you thought we were going to get any blowback back home from that, and how you feel about it. And you just mentioned wind farms. Is the price of all this going to be sort of going back to having more onshore wind farms back home?
Okay, well, a couple of points there, Jason. First of all, I think it's very, very important for everybody to understand that I don't think there's a single person round the table in NATO or the G7 who is against Russians or the Russian people. Absolutely not. Least of all me. I think I'm probably the only Prime Minister in UK history to be called Boris. I think I have that distinction. And I'm not remotely anti-Russian, but I think what we all agree is that what Vladimir Putin is doing, the way he's leading Russia at the moment, is utterly catastrophic, that his invasion of Ukraine is inhuman and barbaric, and the conduct of that invasion is now moving into the type of behaviour that, as I've said before, we haven't seen in the continent of Europe for 80 years, and it's horrific. So you can be sympathetic towards ordinary Russians who are being so badly led, but you can be deeply hostile to the decisions of Vladimir Putin, the way he's leading his country. And sorry, you had another question about onshore wind. Look, I want to be clear. I think the massive opportunity for the UK is in offshore wind, and we've got good at that. We were, until very recently, I'm slightly to my irritation, we seem to have been overtaken now by China, but we were until recently the biggest producer of offshore wind in the world. And one of the things I want to be setting out in the forthcoming British energy security strategy is how we can regain our lead as the #1 and where we're going to be doing it. And I think you can do it in a completely environmentally friendly way. You can generate phenomenal quantities of renewable energy at zero marginal cost, and it is the way forward. Euronews, Meave McMahon. No Euronews. Forgive me. I'm going to go to Natasha Clark from The Sun. Natasha.
Jens Stoltenberg said earlier today that there will be severe consequences if Russia does go ahead and use chemical weapons in Ukraine. What does that mean? Does it mean boots on the ground, or is that something that we're completely ruling out already? And you said earlier that you'd like to see Ukraine handed the hosting of the next World Cup. Would you like to see them automatically qualify for this year's World Cup?
Right, okay, Natasha. So first of all, on chemical, biological, tactical nuclear weapons, all of these are viewed with utter horror by people around the table today. I just heard from my friend Fumio Kishida, who represents the only country in the G7 actually to have experienced nuclear weapons on his, or has seen his country attacked by nuclear weapons. There is a visceral horror of the use of these weapons of mass destruction. I think that if Putin were to engage in anything like that, the consequences would be very, very severe. You have to have a bit of ambiguity about your response, but I think it would be catastrophic for him if he were to do that. And I think that he understands that. But you know, when you look at what he's saying, I think Joe Biden is right to warn, because you know, when the Russians start doing this stuff about oh well, there are factories in Ukraine producing American biological weaponry. You know that is a prelude to a false flag operation, and they could well do something. But I think it would be a profound and a disastrous mistake for Putin were he to do that. On Ukraine qualifying for the European, is it the European? I'm not. Look, football is not my best subject, as you. the World Cup, you mean should they be given a bye and qualify automatically? Sounds like a good idea to me, but I'm out of area here. I've got to admit that's not my strong subject. I don't see why not. Is my view. James, I'm not going to. I'm not going to comment on that, James. I'm not going to comment on that. Let's go to. But look, let me put it this way: given what Ukraine has been going through, given the privations that Ukrainian footballers have had to endure, I'm sure that every possible sympathy and allowances should be made for them. Let me put it that way. How about that? Let's go to Natalia Drozdiak from Bloomberg.
Yeah, I'm right here. Thank you so much.
Yes.
I just had two quick questions. On the nuclear threat, how concrete is that? Can you give us a sense of those discussions? And secondly, you mentioned this morning that allies are examining ways to stop Putin from using Russia's gold reserves. Could you tell us whether those discussions have moved on today? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Natalia. So I think it's very important to stress that I think that the discussion of the use of nuclear weapons is a distraction, and it's intended to be a distraction from what is really going on. And that is a savage attack with conventional means on innocent people in urban centres in Ukraine. Absolutely barbaric use of artillery and mortars and rockets, as I've described, thermobaric bombs included, it now seems. That is what is going on. And what we're talking about is the right of the Ukrainian people to be equipped with the weapons to defend themselves. And all discussion of nuclear weapons is intended to frame this as a confrontation between Russia as a nuclear power and other nuclear powers. That's not what's going on. What's going on is a confrontation between Russia and entirely innocent people in Ukraine. That's what it's between. And what we're trying to do is help those people, and I think that is morally the right thing to do. On gold reserves, there is evidence that the Russians may be trying to get round. I mean, the Russians are obviously going to try to get round the sanctions on their gold, and we're taking steps to try to make sure that there's no leakage, no sale of bullion into markets around the world now, and that's what we're working on. Last question to Steve Swinford of The Times.
Prime Minister, just to come back to Natasha's question, we heard from from a Western official today that if Russia did use chemical weapons in Ukraine, it would be highly unlikely that there would be a military intervention from NATO. Can I just clarify, are you in that position, or would you rule that out, or do you think it's possible that we could have military intervention? Is it something you're prepared to consider?
I just want to repeat the answer I gave to Natasha, which is I think that any such action would be not only morally repugnant, indefensible, but disastrous for Putin as well. And I think, well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave it there and rush for the plane. I'm under strict instructions. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, there, Boris Johnson ending that news conference. He started by saying, rarely have we seen nations more united in response to what we've seen from Russia. He described it as a barbaric invasion that's galvanised the international community. He said sending the quality and quantity of weapons Ukraine needs. He again ruled out a no-fly zone. He talked about the merciless onslaught from the Russian artillery. On energy, he was asked a question about that, and he recognised and acknowledged that different countries, it was more difficult to wean themselves off Russian oil and gas. And he talked also about the conduct of Russia's invasion over the last 4 weeks, the types of behaviour, he said, that hadn't been seen in 80 years. And he said at the end there, and you heard it a couple of times, this will prove disastrous for Vladimir Putin. Well, Boris Johnson, the latest of the leaders to speak there in Brussels. It is, of course, exactly a month since Russian troops invaded Ukraine. Since then, thousands of civilians, Ukrainian soldiers and Russian troops have been killed. Some cities, like Mariupol, have faced a relentless Russian bombardment and suffered almost complete destruction. President Zelensky has called it a terrible, dark month of destruction and urged people around the world to come out and protest against the invasion. Well, our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, has the latest from the capital.
Every life in this country, and indeed far beyond, has been upended by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It has been a month like no other for this country and for countries beyond its borders. President Zelensky has described it as a month of heroic resistance, but also of dark suffering. How can we forget that a month ago at this time, there was dread that it was just a matter of time, even possibly a matter of days, before Russian forces already heading here from the Belarusian border would be in the capital within days. And an airport just west of here, Hostomel Airport, had already been attacked and captured by Russian forces. And where is Ukraine now? Well, that Hostomel airport is still contested, and Russia still hasn't seized a major city, a city of symbolic and strategic value. And not only are the Ukrainians holding ground, they're also going on the offensive. They've taken back Kharkiv, right on the border with the capital Kyiv. They're also taking back territory in the south. But Russia continues to attack. Look at Mariupol, now described as hell on earth, and it's not the only place. So 1 month on, this is still a place where Russia continues its offensive, and the Ukrainians continue their attacks too. Let's look at all the latest developments with this report from Celestina Olulude.
Pictures from a Ukrainian source appearing to show a strike on a Russian naval ship in the occupied port of Berdyansk. Plumes of smoke are seen billowing from the large vessel. If confirmed, this would be a setback to Russia's attempts to create a land bridge in the southeast of Ukraine. Seen here 3 days ago, the ship was capable of carrying up to 1,500 tons of military equipment. The attack took place 80 kilometres from the besieged port city of Mariupol. Once vibrant, these are the scars of a month of war. Russian bombardment leaving ruins and rubble throughout. Standing defiant, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, last night, unusually in English, urged people worldwide to show their support for Ukraine.
This is only the beginning for Russia on the Ukrainian land. Show your standing. Come from your offices, your homes, your schools and universities. Come in the name of peace. Come with Ukrainian symbols to support Ukraine, to support freedom, to support life. Come to your squares, your streets. Make yourselves visible and heard. Say that people matter, freedom matters, peace matters, Ukraine matters.
A significant amount of strategic territory has been taken by Russia, but the capital Kyiv remains in Ukrainian hands, with troops taking back some surrounding areas. Britain will provide 6,000 missiles and £25 million to support the Ukrainian army. But as the war continues into a second month, Ukraine's demands for a no-fly zone are yet to be met. Celestina Olulude, BBC News.
And so another day where President Zelensky has been expressing gratitude for all of the military, humanitarian, political, every kind of support being offered by his neighbours and from many capitals beyond. But another day where he says it's simply not enough. Not enough for a war which still grinds on, a war of attrition, it's now being called, with such a deep sense of foreboding that as bad as it has been, the worst could still be to come.
Lise, we've heard very little in this last week of anything surrounding peace talks. What's your reading of that?
Yes, it's very interesting that almost as soon as this invasion started, the discussions started between Ukrainian and Russian negotiators. And we have been hearing all along that they have been making progress, not just by the negotiating teams, but also by the many mediators who are very keen to be able to say that they are the ones who got President Zelensky and President Putin together to end this war of our time. But I think now, 1 month on, there is a recognition that while some progress has been made, the talks are described as more realistic. President Putin apparently doesn't call again for that horrible word, decapitating the Ukrainian government, the removal of President Zelensky and his team. He doesn't call for the removal of the Ukrainian military. And similarly, Ukraine has understood that it's not going to join NATO anytime soon, if at all. But the issues of territory, of what Russia still wants and wants to keep, remain the most contentious issues of all. The mediators say President Putin will meet President Zelensky when the time is right. But 1 month on, it does seem the time isn't right yet.
Lisa, you were talking about President Zelensky. He has called for protest around the world to mark this 1 month moment. But in terms of help, he's been very specific in what he wants from all those meetings going on in Brussels, and particularly around weapons.
Yes, he's always very clever in his choice of words. Either he or his staff does the research. Every time he addresses a foreign parliament, he touches on the history of the country in question, draws on their most evocative moments, and then asks them to think about Ukraine. Today, in addressing the NATO military alliance, he looked carefully at what kind of weaponry they had, and he said, just give us 1% of your combat aircraft, 1% of your tanks. He said, give us 500 tanks. You've got some 20,000. And so you can see the faces of the NATO leaders sitting there and knowing that, of course, Ukraine is fighting a war for them on their borders, and NATO saying time and again that they will not go beyond the borders of NATO members' territory. But there has been a consistent support and a supply. We don't know all the details. We weren't privy to the discussions today. Jens Stoltenberg said they couldn't reveal, but they are talking about air defense systems, while saying no to a no-fly zone. They are talking about continuing that supply of weapons, and no doubt President Putin and his officers have a close eye on those supply links as well, those supply lines, knowing full well that they are the key to the Ukrainian resistance on the ground and in the air.
Lisa Doucette in Kyiv for us. Now, the NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg has said Vladimir Putin made a big mistake by invading Ukraine and had underestimated the strength and bravery of the Ukrainian people. President Biden has joined Boris Johnson and other NATO leaders in Brussels today for that emergency summit to try to find solutions. Well, here's NATO's Secretary-General just laying out further support that the alliance will actually provide to Ukraine.
On land, we will have substantially more forces in the eastern part of the alliance at higher readiness, with more pre-positioned equipment and supplies. In the air, we will deploy more jets and strengthen our integrated air and missile defense. At sea, we will have carrier strike groups, submarines, and significant numbers of combat ships on a persistent basis. We will also strengthen our cyber defenses and enhance our exercises, focusing on collective defense and interoperability.
Well, that was Jens Stoltenberg. Let me just show you the live pictures from Brussels, because that European Council meeting is underway. Joe Biden expected to brief those European leaders. That the evening picture there in Brussels after a flurry of meetings. Let's speak to our correspondent Jessica Parker, who is there. And Jessica, what are the big lines coming out of the variety of meetings we've had so far?
Yeah, well, you've obviously just heard Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary-General of NATO, and his announcements earlier today, as expected, boosting the eastern flank of the military alliance. Here at the European Council, in the run-up to this meeting of EU leaders, the idea of new sanctions has been rather downplayed by quite a few countries. The big headline issue here tonight and tomorrow is energy. How quickly can Europe wean itself off Russian gas? Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, arriving here this evening has said there'll be a new chapter in the EU's relationship with the US in terms of energy, because the US can potentially supply more liquefied natural gas to Europe to help it on its journey away from Russian supplies. But some countries really are agitating to go a lot farther and faster. Latvia's Prime Minister arriving this afternoon saying oil, coal, that needs to be on the table, hinting at the idea of an embargo, because I think from his perspective, from some other countries in Eastern Europe, Central Europe as well, they think that, okay, it will be difficult, will be damaging, but it has to be done, whereas other countries like Germany, much more cautious.
Yes, that's a big issue, and of course more sanctions being announced and the enforcement of the current round of sanctions also being discussed. We're going to take a short break. I'm back with the assessment from Frank Gardner, what is going on with strategy on the ground in Ukraine, in just a moment or two. Don't go away.
Hello there. Temperatures are going to be near record breaking across parts of California and the southwest around the Great Basin region over the next couple of days, thanks to high pressure and winds coming in from the southeast. Different story though further east. We've got a plunge of cold air moving down across the Midwest into much of the eastern half of the United States behind this weather front. Certainly as we head on into the weekend and into next week, but in the short term it will be fairly mild with some sunshine. A vigorous area of low pressure has brought flooding downpours parts of Paraguay and into the northeast of Argentina, gale force winds as well, but on Friday into the weekend that system should be clearing away. Much of Europe bathed in sunshine thanks to a big area of high pressure, but we've got low pressure affecting southern and eastern Spain, some heavy rainfall here, strong winds. Gradually, temperatures, though, will be recovering across Greece and the islands as that area of low pressure clears away eastwards. Some chilly weather, though, for the northwest of Africa, though conditions look a little bit better in Morocco for Saturday as that low pressure eventually weakens and allows plenty of sunshine to move in its place. The Middle East will be dry, plenty of sunshine this weekend. Fairly strong shamal, though, around the Gulf. That could lift up some dust, and temperatures will be recovering around the Levant and into the Caucasus, but there'll still be some snow showers around over the high ground. Thunderstorms are likely to break out again across southern and western India this weekend. A few across the northeast, but central northern India will be hot and sunny with temperatures into the low 40s in the hottest spots. This area of low pressure will clear away from eastern China by Friday night, so Saturday will be lying across the Korean Peninsula and Japan, bringing heavy rain, also strong gale force winds. Now, some unwelcome rainfalls pushing into parts of New South Wales, southern Queensland, not just for the weekend, into much of next week as well. So that's pretty bad news there, areas which have seen such severe flooding. For New Zealand, it's an improving picture this weekend with high pressure building in.
Ethiopia's civil war is marked by abuses against the defenseless. Thousands have died and millions are in need of aid. 15 months on, there is still a long way to go to find an end to the bloodshed. Join me, Kalkidan Ibeltal, on BBC World News as I report on the impacts of the war from northern Ethiopia.
As Russia's attacks intensify, the BBC's journalists here in Ukraine and around Eastern Europe have witnessed another devastating week for the people of this country. Join me, James Waterhouse, and my colleagues for reporting from the front lines on BBC World News.
The Russians have been trying to advance here along Ukraine's Black Sea coast towards the major port city of Odessa. But so far, they're not making much progress. So, what are the Russians doing wrong and the Ukrainians getting right? Join me, Andrew Harding, here on BBC World News.
I don't think either of us will live to see true equality because we have to deal simultaneously with significant institutional systemic reform.
Africa will always remain important for me, and so I will continue doing what I do.
Most people are not going to judge 2022 by what Trump said. They're going to judge based on life in America.
The view of feminism is still really the same, which is that I think feminism is fundamentally a justice movement.
There will not be any long-term sustainable peace or stability in Afghanistan unless all the factions, all the ethnic groups are represented.
When big names talk, they talk to the BBC.
Welcome back to BBC News. Let's return straight away to Ukraine because it's a month since Russian troops invaded that country. A shocking, devastating month with no end in sight. Thousands of civilians, Ukrainian soldiers and Russian troops have been killed in 4 weeks of fighting. Well, some cities like Mariupol have faced a relentless Russian bombardment and suffered almost complete destruction. So we're into the second month of this war. Let's take stock of where we are when it comes to strategy. Here's our security correspondent, Frank Gardner, with his assessment.
So just why has it gone so badly for Russia in these first few weeks of the war? Well, there are a number of reasons. There is the strength of Ukrainian resistance. Most of the population has rallied around their government. The troops are using Western-supplied weapons like Javelin and Stinger missiles. And when it comes to getting inside big cities, Russia doesn't have enough troops to take on the defenders in most cases. Here's their charismatic president, Volodymyr Zelensky, a one-time comic actor who's rallied the nation, refusing to leave the capital, even though there's a bounty on his head. Then there's poor Russian tactics. Russian commanders on the ground have largely failed to take full advantage of all the tools at their disposal. Things like armoured vehicles, artillery, rocket launchers, helicopters, all of which, when combined with infantry, can have a massive effect, but which the Russians have failed to master. The Russian Air Force is 15 times bigger than Ukraine's, yet they've failed to achieve supremacy in the skies. And finally, there's poor Russian logistics and communications. Russian soldiers have not always maintained their vehicles properly, meaning that many of them are breaking down. And when it comes to radios, a lot of them don't work, forcing them to use mobile phones, which can easily be intercepted by the Ukrainians. Many of the Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine thought they were just going on exercise, like this one in Belarus. That didn't give them enough time to prepare for battle.
Exercises never prepared troops properly for combat, so that they were not combat ready.
Sorry to leave that straight back to Brussels because Joe Biden has just started to speak.
Thank you for taking the time. Today marks 1 month since Russia began its carnage in Ukraine, the brutal invasion of Ukraine. And we held a NATO summit the very next day. At that time, my overwhelming objective in wanting that summit was to have absolute unity on 3 key important issues among our NATO and European allies. First was to support Ukraine with military and humanitarian assistance. Second was to impose the most significant sanctions, economic sanction regime ever, in order to cripple Putin's economy and punish him for his actions. Third was to fortify the eastern flank of our NATO allies, who were obviously very, very concerned and somewhat worried what would happen. We accomplished all 3 of these, and today we're determined to sustain those efforts and to build on them. The United States is committed to provide over $2 billion in military equipment to Ukraine since I became president, anti-air systems, anti-armor systems, ammunition, and our weapons are flowing into Ukraine as I speak. And today I'm announcing the United States is prepared to commit more than $1 billion in humanitarian assistance to help get relief to millions of Ukrainians affected by the war in Ukraine. Many Ukrainian refugees will wish to stay in Europe, closer to their homes. But we've also will welcome 100,000 Ukrainians to the United States with a focus on reuniting families. And we will invest $320 million to bolster democratic resilience and defend human rights in Ukraine and neighboring countries. We're also coordinating with the G7 and the Euro energy security. And I'll have more to say about that tomorrow. We're also announcing new sanctions of more than 400 individuals and entities in alignment with the European Union. More than 300 members of the Duma, oligarchs, and Russian defense companies that fuel the Russian war machine. In addition to the 100,000 U.S. forces now stationed in Europe to defend NATO territory, NATO established, as you already know, 4 new battle groups in Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Slovakia to reinforce the Eastern Front. Putin was banking on NATO being split, My early conversation with him in December and early January, it was clear to me he didn't think we could sustain this cohesion. NATO has never been more united than it is today. Putin is getting exactly the opposite what he intended to have as a consequence of going into Ukraine. We've built that same unity with the European Union and with the leading democracies of the G7, in the G7. So I want to thank you, and I'll be now happy to take your questions. Since there's so many people out there, been given a list. Now, how about Chris of the Associated Press? First question.
Hi, thank you, Mr. President. So you've warned about the real threat of chemical weapons being used. Have you gathered specific intelligence that suggests that President Putin is deploying these weapons, moving them into position, or considering their use? And would the U.S. or NATO respond with military action if he did use chemical weapons?
You know, on the first question, I can't answer that. I'm not going to give you intelligence data, number one. Number two, we would respond. We would respond if he uses it. The nature of the response would depend on the nature of the use. Josh of Bloomberg.
Perhaps I'll just project, Mr. President. Thank you very much.
If I had your voice, I'd have been elected a lot earlier.
I'll give it a try. He's got a long arm. Thank you. Can you talk to us about two things, sir? One, since your conversation with President Xi of China, have you seen any indications of action or lack of action from China that has led you to believe whether they will intervene and help Russia, either with the sale of arms or the provision of supplies to support this war in Ukraine? And secondly, can you say whether the conversation today turned to the subject of food shortages and what the U.S. will do to address wheat shortages in particular as a result of this war? Thank you.
On the first question relating to President Xi Jinping of China, I had a very straightforward conversation with Xi now, I guess it's 6 days ago, 7 days ago, in that range. And I made it clear to him, I made no threats, but I made it clear to him that make sure he understood the consequences of him helping Russia, as had been reported and as what it was expected. And I made no threats, but I pointed out the number of American and foreign corporations that left Russia as a consequence of their barbaric behavior. And I indicated that I knew how much because we had long discussions in the past about his interest in making sure he had economic relations and economic growth with Europe and the United States, and indicated that he'd be putting himself at significant jeopardy in those aims if, in fact, he were to move forward. I am not going to comment on any detail about what we know or don't know as a consequence of that conversation. But tomorrow or next Monday that Ursula is having that conference with China. The first, on April 1st. We've had discussions because I think that China understands that its economic future is much more closely tied to the West than it is to Russia. And so I'm hopeful that he does not get engaged. We also did discuss today that there's a need for us to set up, NATO to set up, and the EU, to set up a system whereby we have an organization looking at who has violated any of the sanctions and where and when and how they violated them. And that's something we're going to put in train. It's not done yet. So with regard to Xi, I have nothing more to report. With regard to food shortages, yes, we did talk about food shortages. And it's going to be real. The price of these sanctions is not just imposed upon Russia. It's imposed upon an awful lot of countries as well, including European countries and our country as well. And because both Russia and Ukraine have been the breadbasket of Europe in terms of wheat, for example, just to give you one example. But we had a long discussion in the G7 with both the United States, which has a significant, the third largest producer of wheat in the world, as well as Canada, which is also a major, major producer. And we both talked about how we could increase and disseminate more rapidly food shortages. And in addition to that, we talked about urging all the European countries and everyone else to end trade restrictions on sending limitations on sending food abroad. And so we are in the process of working out with our European friends what it would take to help alleviate the concerns relative to food shortages. We also talked about a significant major U.S. investment, among others, in terms of providing for the need for humanitarian assistance, including food, as we move forward. Tarina of the Wall Street Journal. Watch out you don't get hit in the head there now.
Mr. President, in your view, does President Zelensky need to cede any Ukrainian territory in order to gain a ceasefire with Russia, or is that completely off the table? And then also, do you think that Russia needs to be removed from the G20?
On the latter point, my answer is yes. That depends on the G20. That was raised today, and I raised the possibility, if that can't be done, if Indonesia and others do not agree, then we should, in my view, ask to have both Ukraine be able to attend the meetings, as well as basically Ukraine being able to attend the G20 meeting and observe. With regard to, what was the first question?
If you think that Ukraine needs to cease, to give up any territory in order to get a ceasefire.
That is a total judgment based on Ukraine. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. I don't believe that they're going to have to do that, but that's a judgment. There's negotiations, that are discussions, I should say, that have taken place that I have not been part of, including the Ukrainians, and it's their judgment to make. Cecilia, ABC. There you are.
Oh, absolutely, that way. Thank you. Sir, you've made it very clear in this conflict that you do not want to see World War III. But is it possible that in expressing that so early that you were too quick to rule out direct military intervention in this war? Could Putin have been emboldened knowing that you are not going to get involved directly in this conflict?
No and no.
That. And to clarify on chemical weapons, if chemical weapons were used in Ukraine, would that trigger a military response from NATO?
It would trigger a response in kind. Whether or not you're asking whether NATO would cross, we'd make that decision at the time.
And my final question, because you're heading to Poland tomorrow, do you think that getting a first-hand look at the effects of this war on these millions of Ukrainians who have fled their country could change the way that you might respond?
I don't think so, because I've been to many, many war zones. I've been in refugee camps. I've been in war zones for the last 15 years, and it's devastating. And but the thing you look at the most is you see these young children. You see children without parents that are in those camps or in refugees. You see women and husbands, men and women who are completely lost and have no nose. You see the look, that blank look on their face, that absolute feeling of, my God, where am I? What's going to happen to me? And so what it will do, it will reinforce my commitment to have the United States make sure we are a major piece of dealing with the relocation of all those folks, as well as humanitarian assistance needed both inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine. For example, this is not something that Poland or Romania or Germany should carry on their own. This is an international responsibility. The United States, as a leader, one of the leaders in the international community, has an obligation to be engaged and do all we can to ease the suffering and pain of innocent women and children and men, for that matter, throughout Ukraine. and those who have made it across the border. I plan on attempting to see those folks, as well as I hope I'm going to be able to see, I guess I'm not supposed to say where I'm going, am I? But anyway, I hope I get to see a lot of people. Marcus of Der Spiegel.
Thanks, Mr. President. There's a presidential election coming up in 2024, and as you know,
kidding.
there are yes, that's true. And there are widespread concerns in Europe that a figure like your predecessor, maybe even your predecessor himself, might get elected president again. Are there any steps, anything you are trying to do and NATO is trying to do here these days to prevent what you're trying to do becoming undone 2 years from now? Thank you.
No, that's not how I think of this. I've been dealing with foreign policy for longer than anybody that's involved in this process right now. I have no concerns about the impact. I made a commitment when I ran this time. I wasn't going to run again, and I mean that sincerely. I had no intention of running for president again. And until I saw those folks coming out of the fields in Virginia carrying torches and carrying Nazi banners and literally singing the same vile rhyme that they used in Germany in the early 20s, or 30s, I should say. And then when the gentleman you mentioned was asked what he thought, and a young woman was killed, a protester, and he was asked what he thought, he said, "They're very good people on both sides." And that's when I decided I wasn't going to be quiet any longer. And when I ran this time, and I think the American press, whether they look at me favorably or unfavorably, will acknowledge this, I made a determination. Nothing is worth, no election is worth my not doing exactly what I think is the right thing. Not a joke. I'm too long in the tooth to fool with this any longer. And so we're a long way off in elections, a long way off. My focus, if any election, is on making sure that we retain the House and the United States Senate so that I have the room to continue to do the things that I've been able to do in terms of grow the economy and deal in a rational way with American foreign policy and lead the world, be the leader of the free world. So, but it's not an illogical question for someone to ask. I say to people at home, imagine if we sat and watched the doors of the Bundestag broken down and police officers killed and hundreds of people storming in. Or imagine if we saw that happening in the British Parliament or whatever. How would we feel? And one of the things that I take some solace from is I don't think you'll find any European leader who thinks that I am not up to the job. And I mean that sincerely. It's not like, whoa, it's that. The point is that when the first G7 meeting I attended, like the one I did today, was in Great Britain. And I sat down and I said, America's back. And one of my counterparts, colleagues, as head of state, said, for how long? For how long? And so I don't blame, I don't criticize anybody for asking that question. But the next election, I'd be very fortunate if I had that same man running against me. Thank you very, very much.
Mr. President, was there something?
Whoa. No. Yeah, one final question, right. Hey, look, wait, hold on a second, please. I was supposed to be an hour ago at the European Union meeting and to speak. No, I'm thanking you. So someone I haven't called on before. You. Who are you?
I'm Christina Arcady from CBS. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Sir, deterrence didn't work. What makes you think Vladimir Putin will alter course based on the action you've taken today?
Let's get something straight. You remember, if you covered me from the very beginning, I did not say that, in fact, the sanctions would deter him. Sanctions never deter. You keep talking about that. Sanctions never deter. The maintenance of sanctions, the maintenance of sanctions, the increasing the pain, and the demonstration why I asked for this NATO meeting today is to be sure that after a month we will sustain what we're doing, not just next month, the following month, but for the remainder of this entire year. That's what will stop him.
You believe the action today will have an impact on making Russia change course in Ukraine?
That's not what I said. You're playing a game with me. I know. The answer is no. I think what happens is we have to demonstrate the purpose. The single most important thing is for us to stay unified. And the world continue to focus on what a brute this guy is. And all the innocent people's lives are being lost and ruined. And what's going on. That's the important thing. But look, if you're Putin and you think that Europe is going to crack in a month or 6 weeks or 2 months, why not? They can take anything for another month, but we have to demonstrate. The reason I asked for the meeting, we have to stay fully, totally, thoroughly united. Thank you.
Well, the questions go on, but Joe Biden leaving after those comments, starting by saying 3 principles determined the last month: supporting Ukraine, punishing Vladimir Putin with the sanctions, and fortifying NATO's eastern flank. And you heard him right at the end saying it is all about sustaining the pressure on Vladimir Putin. But he announced an extra $1 billion for humanitarian assistance. He talked about new sanctions, another 400 individuals and elites added to the list. He talked about the 4 new battle groups heading to the eastern flank of NATO. And he said the international community has never been more united than it is today, the opposite of what Vladimir Putin wanted. He was asked about chemical weapons, and this was an interesting response, because he was asked what would the response be if chemical weapons were used, and he said we would respond in terms of the nature of the use, so deliberately vague around what sort of red line actually exists. And he was also asked about China, the conversations with President Xi, and said he made it quite clear the consequences. No threats, he said, but if they ended up helping and supporting Russia. So just some of the key lines there from Joe Biden speaking in the last few minutes. Well, you're watching BBC News. Let's turn to UK politics now, because the UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak has defended his spring statement of yesterday after critics said he hadn't done enough to actually help families who are struggling with rising bills. One think tank has warned that 1.3 million people will fall below the poverty line from April, even with the government measures announced yesterday. The opposition Labour Party have called the policies a disaster for working families. Well, let's get more on the impact on disabled people. Let's talk to Philip Anderson, who's head of policy at the MS Society. Thank you so much for being here with us and your patience for waiting whilst we're hearing from the US President. Your assessment, first of all, on what you heard from the Finance Minister yesterday.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the debate has focused on whether the Chancellor is doing enough to help people in a cost of living crisis. And I think a point I'd really like to get across is actually, for a lot of disabled people, he's doing the exact opposite of helping. We're seeing a real terms cut to welfare benefits that many people rely on, which is going to leave disabled people, in many cases, hundreds of pounds worse off at a time when they absolutely cannot afford to be.
And do you think disabled people are disproportionately affected? We know all about the energy crisis, the costs. Take us through the additional impact.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think something that people maybe don't always think about is that there are a lot of unavoidable costs that come with having a disability. There's research that shows that a person living with a neurological condition like multiple sclerosis spends on average nearly £200 a week on unavoidable extra costs related to having the condition, for things like help around the home or getting around with reduced mobility. Disability benefits will generally cover less than half of that. And all of those costs rise with the cost of living, along with the same cost that everyone else is dealing with. So I think that's really one of the key reasons that we've seen the pandemic hit disabled people so hard.
Philip, I'm so sorry that it is such a short interview, but we're about to end our programme, so we have to end the interview. Thank you, though, for your patience and for those brief comments. We're here in a moment with all our teams in Ukraine with the very latest. You're watching BBC News.
Hello there. Temperatures are going to be near record breaking across parts of California and the southwest around the Great Basin region over the next couple of days, thanks to high pressure and winds coming in from the southeast. Different story though further east. We've got a plunge of cold air moving down across the Midwest into much of the eastern half of the United States behind this weather front. Certainly as we head on into the weekend and into next week, but in the short term it will be fairly mild with some sunshine. A vigorous area of low pressure has brought flooding downpours parts of Paraguay and into the northeast of Argentina, gale force winds as well, but on Friday into the weekend that system should be clearing away. Much of Europe bathed in sunshine thanks to a big area of high pressure, but we've got low pressure affecting southern and eastern Spain, some heavy rainfall here, strong winds. Gradually, temperatures, though, will be recovering across Greece and the islands as that area of low pressure clears away eastwards. Some chilly weather, though, for the northwest of Africa, though conditions look a little bit better in Morocco for Saturday as that low pressure eventually weakens and allows plenty of sunshine to move in its place. The Middle East will be dry, plenty of sunshine this weekend. Fairly strong shamar, though, around the Gulf. That could lift up some dust, and temperatures will be recovering around the Levant and into the Caucasus, but there'll still be some snow showers around over the high ground. Thunderstorms are likely to break out again across southern and western India this weekend. A few across the northeast, but central northern India will be hot and sunny with temperatures into the low 40s in the hottest spots. This area of low pressure will clear away from eastern China by Friday night, so Saturday will be lying across the Korean Peninsula and Japan, bringing heavy rain, also strong gale force winds. Now, some unwelcome rainfalls pushing into parts of New South Wales, southern Queensland, not just for the weekend, into much of next week as well. So that's pretty bad news there, areas which have seen such severe flooding. For New Zealand, it's an improving picture this weekend with high pressure building in.
What we hope and pray that finally after 40 years, the people of Afghanistan will have peace and stability.
My view of feminism is still really the same, which is that I think feminism is fundamentally a justice movement.
Africa will always remain important for me, and so I will continue doing what I do.
I could not have had a career as a gay man.
When big names talk, they talk to the BBC.
This is the Russian attack playbook, perfected in over 10 years of war in Syria.
Tonight, it was far noisier, much louder, more constant, like rolling thunder for a very long time.
Remember, it was Russia that launched this offensive, sending its troops across the border into a sovereign nation.
If Vladimir Putin expected his troops to be met here as liberators, then signs like this all along the roads here are sending a very different message.
We break stories from more places than any other international news broadcaster. We are the leaders in global breaking news.
This is BBC News. I'm Matthew Emery-Waller. World leaders gather to discuss the war in Ukraine 1 month on from the Russian invasion. We have a special report from the front line inside the city of Kharkiv that's under constant Russian bombardment.
You can see what they're up against here. This is daily, but the steadfastness of these men has been felt not just in Kharkiv, but around the world. They've had 4 weeks of this, and still they remain. The Russians haven't been able to break their lines.
Western leaders meeting in Brussels promise to increase military aid to Ukraine and send tens of thousands more troops to countries in Eastern Europe.
Get it down!
In other news here in Britain, a jury at the Old Bailey has shown footage of the moment the man accused of murdering the MP Sir David Amess was tackled by police. He denies murder. And the boss of P&O Ferries has admitted breaking the law by sacking 800 workers without consulting unions. Hello and welcome to BBC News. A month after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO has announced it's sending 40,000 more troops to Eastern Europe. The NATO Secretary-General has spoken of how the war has changed European military security for the long term. And he was speaking on the day that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky made another appeal for tanks and planes to bolster his country's armed response. Well, NATO leaders and the leaders of the G7 group of industrialised nations have been meeting in a show of unity to discuss their next steps, both military and economic, against Vladimir Putin. And in the last half an hour, the US President Joe Biden has been talking. Let's go to Lviv and to Ben Brown.
Hello, good evening from Lviv here in western Ukraine. Well, a month ago today, the world changed when Russia invaded this country. Since then, thousands of Russian and Ukrainian troops have been killed, as well as a huge number of civilians. More than 3 million people have been forced to flee from Ukraine. And today, leaders of the Western military alliance, NATO, met in Brussels to discuss what the world should do now. Well, we start tonight with a special report from the city of Kharkiv in the east of the country. Less than 25 miles from the Russian border, it has faced relentless Russian missile strikes and shelling. Our correspondent, Quentin Somerville, and camera journalist Darren Conway have spent time with two fighters who've been on the front line since the very beginning.
A month of fighting alone. And Russian guns still haven't silenced Ukraine's cry for freedom. At the Kharkiv Philharmonic, Maria Baranovska may not have an audience, but this isn't a city abandoned, only a city half gone. She remains here with her 10-month-old boy. Staying is her duty.
I believe in our victory. I know that the armed forces of Ukraine will protect their home. We just need to be a little bit more patient.
Standing united with the boys defending her and her son. A month ago, 22-year-old Vlad said goodbye to his own mother and went off to fight. He and fellow private Mark have been here ever since. They've quickly grown comfortable with war's daily tempo. They have the upper hand in Kharkiv. What are you fighting for?
For peace in Ukraine.
And what about you, Mark?
Like my comrade just said, for peace in Ukraine. These people came to our land. No one was waiting for them here. No one asked them to come.
And what do you want to tell the Russian soldiers that are shelling you?
Run. We were not calling you here. Run away. There is nothing else to say. Either you stay here forever, in the ground, or you go back home and stop killing children and destroying homes and families.
Go back home while you are still alive.
Their steady determination and a little help from Western weaponry have got them this far. It's time to head out to the front again. This, they say, is their land. They know these fields and villages better than the invaders. And here, amid the melting winter snows, they cover every inch of ground. Ukrainian mud is the defender's friend. Mark's foxhole has room for one and offers just about enough protection from exploding Russian shells. Suddenly, on the horizon, there is movement. An enemy scouting party is spotted. Russians shoot back. But the danger here is artillery. Mark tells us we have to move. The Russians will definitely respond, he says, 100%. It's time to seek better cover.
What is it like spending day and night out in those tiny, tiny little trenches?
The shifts are longer during the day, but at night when it's cold, we swap often.
It's okay, you get used to it. Humans can adapt. Humans can adapt to everything.
What's going on right now?
They are targeting our position.
The shells begin to land all around us, only meters away.
You can see what they're up against here. This is daily, but the steadfastness of these men has been felt not just in Kharkiv, but around the world. They've had 4 weeks of this, and still they remain. The Russians haven't been able to break their lines, and this invasion might have come as a surprise to the rest of the world, but this is what they've been expecting and training for years.
Unable to move, the shelling is relentless. These bombardments are endless. This is Russia's tactic of choice. We're told for the third time that day to get into a nearby underground shelter.
The Russians are pretty determined to break these lines. Are they going to get past here? Are they going to get past you and these men?
I think no. We will not surrender Kharkiv. Our loved ones have got our backs. They won't get through here.
Quentin Somerville, BBC News, Kharkiv.
Well, 3 weeks ago, a huge convoy of Russian troops moved towards the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, but its advance was stalled. Since then, fierce fighting has been taking place in the towns and cities outside the capital, and Ukrainian forces now claim they have succeeded in pushing Russian troops back with a series of counterattacks, as Jeremy Bowen reports.
In small groups, Ukrainian soldiers are crossing the river Irpin, joining the month-long battle to keep the Russians out of Kyiv. It's bad, said Pavlo, one of the last civilians leaving. Children are dying, everyone is dying. Only a few other civilians are coming out of the ruins. Slava emerged, desperate to save her dogs. Thousands of civilians came this way when the war started, but now this whole area has been swept up by the fighting. Ukrainian troops have broken all the Russian ground attacks here so far, so now Moscow's men increasingly are using the weapon they trust most, heavy artillery. We were here about 3 weeks ago, and there is a massive difference. Look at the devastation around this area. It's been hit very heavily. The shelling makes all movement here dangerous, so the command posts are underground. The Ukrainians say the Russians have only a toehold in Irpin. Outside, they've been pushed back. You say they can't get into the city. Why is that? Apart from your own resistance, what do they lack? Commander Oleg said the Russians don't have the combat power, his men are hitting their supplies, and in Kyiv there'd be armed citizens shooting from every window and door. Shane Matthews, a former British soldier, is fighting here. He's a medic and a sniper and says this is the worst he's seen.
I have seen a lot of civilians killed, yes. We witnessed a car with 4 people in not 10 days ago get blown to pieces. It was an entire family evacuating from the city behind us. It took a direct hit from a 155mm artillery round.
So nothing left?
Nothing. No. You could have swept them up and put them into a bin liner.
On the road to Kyiv, which the Russians have tried repeatedly to seize, the forest either side is burning from the shells. Back in the city's centre, more volunteers were waiting to be transferred to the long fight in and around Irpin. It was quiet, a little tense. They knew what would be waiting for them. Katrin had a few minutes with her son. She's a sniper. She said his name is Nikita, he's 18 months old. I will kill, she said, to protect his future. The war has changed everything for these volunteers, for all of Ukraine, and the world now feels more dangerous.
Whatever happens in the battles that these soldiers are going to fight, it's clear already after a month that this is the biggest threat to international peace and security in decades, and the consequences, the impact of this war is already being felt beyond the borders of Ukraine.
The younger ones were born when Europe was hopeful in the 1990s. The men in their 60s grew up when this city was part of the Soviet Union. It was time to say goodbye. The old drumbeat of the Cold War, of the risks of confrontation between the big powers, is back for a new generation. The buses left for the front line. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Kyiv.
Well, world leaders, including the US President Joe Biden, have been gathering in Brussels today for 3 major summits on the war here in Ukraine. The NATO military alliance approved plans to increase military aid to Ukraine and to send more troops to neighbouring Eastern European countries in the face of what NATO has called the biggest security crisis in a generation. Leaders of the EU and the G7, the group of the world's largest economies, are also meeting today in a display of international unity. Our North America editor, Sarah Smith, reports.
This show of solidarity is why President Biden's here, with the NATO chief and over 30 other world leaders, to display the unity they believe is their strength. Although Boris Johnson looks remarkably isolated, even as the Kremlin crowned him the most active anti-Russian leader.
I've rarely seen our nations more united in recent years than we are now. Putin's failure in Ukraine is vital for the peace and prosperity of all of us, and his barbaric invasion has galvanized the international community into collective action.
The NATO summit is naturally focused on defence, how to help defend Ukraine. More weapons and equipment are being promised, with Britain pledging to double the number of missiles being sent. But Ukrainian President Zelensky wants far more.
You can give us 1% of all your aircraft, 1% of all your tanks, 1%. We can't just buy it. Such a supply directly depends only on NATO's decisions, on political decisions, by the way.
NATO will not send troops to Ukraine, but will station many more forces in member countries bordering Russia as the alliance turns to face east. NATO is being rapidly reshaped by this war in Ukraine in ways that, frankly, the US has been pressing for years. On the plane on the way over here, President Biden's national security advisor told me it is time for member countries to put their money where their mouths are. In other words, European countries need to spend more and contribute more forces, and for many years to come.
Putin was banking on NATO being split. My early conversation with him in December and early January, it was clear to me he didn't think we could sustain this cohesion. NATO has never been more united than it is today. Putin is getting exactly the opposite what he intended to have as a consequence of going into Ukraine.
At the G7 economic meeting, sanctions were on the table, with more imposed on Russia today, as everyone keeps a wary eye on whether China will try to assist Russia, either financially or militarily. Ending Europe's dependence on Russian oil and gas is next on the agenda. The US will promise to send supplies of liquefied natural gas soon, but wants to know there's a long-term plan to get supplies elsewhere, as the crisis in Ukraine is reshaping global relations for the long term. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Brussels.
Well, 1 month to the day after Russia invaded this country, Ukrainians are now wondering how many more months of war lie ahead, how many more people here will die or be forced to flee from their homes. That is it from me and the team here in Lviv in Western Ukraine. Back to you in the studio in London.
Ben, thanks very much. Thanks to Ben and all of our correspondents and teams across Ukraine. Well, Vladimir Putin has never called it a war, but rather a special operation to demilitarize his neighbours. Russia has seen protesters take to the streets, and life for many has been changed drastically by economic sanctions. Our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, reports now from St. Petersburg. A warning, his report does contain flashing images.
At the age of 76, she's a prolific artist. But for Yelena Osipova, the priority now isn't paintings, it's placards. They're anti-war and anti-Putin. Putin is war, this one says. We don't want to die for Putin. After Russia attacked Ukraine, Yelena took to the streets of St. Petersburg. Like many anti-war protests in Russia, it ended like this. She describes one of her favourite placards the police haven't given back.
I'd been given some red tulips, beautiful young flowers, but very quickly they died and wilted. They reminded me of young men falling into their graves. So I made a poster and wrote that people were being sent to their deaths.
In Vladimir Putin's home city, home truths about Ukraine. And deep concern. This human rights group is taking calls from Russian mothers, worried that their conscript sons are in Ukraine. Under intense pressure from the authorities, the group is having to close down.
The authorities prefer to cover up problems, to give society a false picture that everything in the army is absolutely fine. They want soldiers' mothers to be patient and to be silent.
For the staff, a moment of reflection and prayers for an end to the fighting. But when this conflict does end, life here will never be the same. When Vladimir Putin came to power in Russia more than 20 years ago, he promised Russians security and stability. Today, his army is suffering losses in Ukraine. The economy here is suffering from sanctions, and Russia is facing growing international isolation. But from the Kremlin, no hint of regret. And Putin knows that many Russians do still trust him, because he controls the media here and the messaging. Many here still believe he is taking Russia in the right direction, even if that means confrontation and conflict. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, St. Petersburg.
Well, just a little earlier I spoke to Nina Khrushcheva, an expert on Russian and Eastern European affairs. She's also the great-granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev, who led the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. I asked her how surprised she'd been that Russia had actually invaded Ukraine.
Well, I was one of those people who argued repeatedly that Russia is a grand country, it's a big country, so its negotiation tactics are also very grand and scary. So I was in shock when it did happen, because it seems completely irrational. I mean, and we see it's a month into this war, and it's completely irrational. It goes against every single national interest there is. It goes against all the goals that Putin stated, that we want a new security negotiations in Europe. We want collective security. We want NATO to be less threatening to Russia, not more. And what's remarkable that he achieved just absolutely the opposite. In fact, NATO countries are meeting in Brussels, and there's a certain amount of unity that probably they haven't seen since the war in Iraq or even war in Afghanistan since early 2000s, when all those American wars were declared. So he achieved just the opposite.
You said in a recent article you felt shame at this invasion. Why, given that this is straight out of the Kremlin, straight out of one man?
Well, I mean, I'm a Russian. I'm responsible for my nation. I mean, that's what essentially we all talk about when we talk about democracies. That's what you go and protest. That's why you express your opinion. That's why there is a freedom of speech in normal countries, because you are responsible for the actions of your nation. Also, you know, you mentioned Nikita Khrushchev, and he had his own share of bad behavior, sort of Soviet oppressive behavior. And I do feel responsible for that too, because I try to be a good citizen. So yes, I am ashamed. And I think a lot of Russians, in fact, you know that, I'm sure you've reported on, I know you've reported on this, at least 300,000 Russians left because they feel responsible, they feel ashamed, they feel that they can speak freely from elsewhere, because in Russia now you cannot make a peep if it's not in agreement with the Kremlin or not in agreement with the Ministry of Defense.
Yes, we're seeing as you speak pictures of your great-grandfather, and you've written about, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you say that, of course, Khrushchev was a major participant in that, but you then go on to say you think that if you're going to push and your opponent is going to blink, then you push and your opponent doesn't blink. What do you do then? So what is the way out of this, do you think?
Well, I think, I mean, it was a nice comparison with the Cuban Missile Crisis when there were negotiations for 3 months. But I think we're way past that. I mean, you know, Khrushchev was dubbed as a very impulsive politician, a politician who would get to the brink of confrontation, but then back off, as he did with the Cuban Missile Crisis, because when he realized that even the smallest mistake can bring a horrible disaster for the world, he and Kennedy really quickly wrapped it up. It only took 13 days. So, but comparing with the impulsive Khrushchev, I mean, Putin does seem, I mean, Khrushchev now seems very zen comparing to what Putin has done in Ukraine. I don't know what the exit strategy is for Putin. It does seem to me that he's no longer there for any agreements or negotiations. He's there to make a point. If you disregard me, and by definition, if you disregard me, that is, you disregard Russia, you don't respect it, then you're going to get it, and at any cost. And that's why I find all this nuclear mentioning, the chemical weapons mentioning is very, very frightening, because it does seem that Putin is ready to go as far as he needs to go to prove a point that Russia is a great country, and he's Putin the first, the great new Tsar, the great president of Russia.
Nina Khrushcheva talking to me a little earlier on the programme. We're quite close to the end of the programme. Let me just remind you, in the last half an hour or so, Joe Biden has been talking after those variety of meetings that are currently still going on in Brussels, saying 3 principles had directed the international community over the last 4 weeks: supporting Ukraine. He said we also have to punish Vladimir Putin, make the sanctions really count, and also to fortify the eastern flank of NATO. He said the international community had never been more united than it is today, the opposite of what Vladimir Putin had wanted. And an interesting exchange when he was asked about the potential use of chemical weapons by Russia. He said the nature of the response would depend on the nature of the use. He, of course, was vice president when President Obama had those red lines crossed in Syria, so much more cautious in the exact language he uses about potential consequences. Let me just show you some of the latest pictures that we've been showing through the course of the day. We start with what is seen as a setback for Russia, that attack at Berdansk on a Russian supply ship, and the Ukrainians managing to hit that, and of course Russia trying to set up that land corridor in the south. And I'll show you the latest pictures from Mariupol, the extraordinary damage of that city in the south. 80–90% of the city completely destroyed. Well, that brings us to the end of the programme. Thank you so much for watching. Do stay with us for continuous coverage here on BBC News. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Hello there. Conditions are improving across the southeast of Europe. That area of low pressure clearing away, taking the cold air and the showers with it, though much of southern Turkey, Cyprus will be cold over the next couple of days. But for Greece, the islands, temperatures are slowly recovering back to the seasonal norm eventually. For much of Iberia, though, very unsettled. This area of low pressure bringing further heavy flooding rainfall to southern and eastern Spain, to the Balearics, strong winds, choppy seas as well. But much of the southeast of Europe should turn drier through Friday and into the weekend. Those temperatures in Athens, at least into the 20s. Something we haven't seen for quite a few weeks. Warm, dry and sunny for much of Italy, Sicily, but unsettled for both Spain and Portugal. For the Pyrenees northwards, though, and much of central northern Europe, it's bathed in sunshine because of this large area of high pressure. So the winds will remain light. But things will be turning colder, more wintry across Scandinavia, northern Europe into the Baltic states during this weekend into next week, as low pressure sinks its way southwards. This area of low pressure continuing to bring further rain to eastern Spain and the Balearics on Saturday, slowly pushing a little bit further northeastwards. The outlook then for London and for Paris, it stays quite warm for the next few days, but then we start to tap into that colder air moving down from the north into the middle part of next week. For Athens, though, temperatures remaining around the mid to high teens Celsius, so something warmer than what we've had of late.
This is the Russian attack playbook, perfected in over 10 years of war in Syria.
Tonight, it was far noisier, much louder, more constant, like rolling thunder for a very long time.
Remember, it was Russia that launched this offensive, sending its troops across the border into a sovereign nation.
If Vladimir Putin expected his troops to be met here as liberators, then signs like this all along the roads here are sending a very different message.
We break stories from more places than any other international news broadcaster. We are the leaders in global breaking news.
You're one of the most influential musicians in modern history. How would you assess your influence?
I look at myself, honestly, as a worker bee. And I walk into the studio and my only job is to make sure that artistically we wind up in a better place than we started.
Yeah. The hit maker.
Yeah.
Tell me the artists that you've worked with holding that guitar.
It's the main workhorse in my life. And people, they laugh at me, they make fun of me because they think that I treat it poorly. And I say, you don't understand. I show up to work. This guitar is there to work.
But that's probably responsible for what? It's over $1 billion worth of music you've made and produced and written on there.
From Los Angeles, Talking Movies will be previewing the Academy Awards. We'll be looking at who might be going home with the top prizes and what's going to happen at the ceremony. Also, how death stories have moved front and centre in the Academy Awards race. Join me, Tom Brooke, for Talking Movies on BBC World News.
BBC experts check the facts behind the stories making the headlines. Go to the BBC News website and app to answer any questions you have about the big stories of the day. Reality Check. Get the facts straight.
Now on BBC World News, Hard Talk asks tough questions in interviews with people who are shaping the news.
Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Gabriel Gatehouse. My guest today is a former member of the Russian parliament who's fighting in Ukraine against Russia. A man who's long said he wants to bring down Vladimir Putin, but who was once on the Russian government payroll. Ilya Ponomaryov has had his feet in many camps, among the Russian elites, inside the popular opposition, and now with the Ukrainian defense forces. So, what will be the repercussions of this war in Ukraine and in Russia, on the streets and in the Kremlin? Ilya Ponomaryov, welcome to Hard Talk.
Hello, Gabriel. Thanks for having me here again.
You're a political exile now, a Russian in Ukraine, dressed in khaki. You said recently, I chose Ukraine because it's the best place to bring down Vladimir Putin's regime. You've joined Ukraine's territorial defense forces. What is your role in this? Are you picking up a gun or what?
I want to stress that I'm not fighting against Russia, I'm fighting against Putin and against Putinism. That's very much the same as anti-fascists during World War II, who were joining British, Norwegian and Soviet forces. They also were fighting against fascism. They were not fighting against their motherland because they became to hate Germans. No, they hated fascists. And that's very much the same what we are doing here. In territorial defense, that's like volunteers who are armed and who are fighting against the aggression, protecting the cities. And these volunteers, they usually have Kalashnikovs or machine guns, sometimes slightly more heavier hardware, and some of those units have anti-tank missiles as well.
But there are two wars going on here. There's the physical war, the hot war. There's also the information war. Which of those are you fighting?
I'm actually doing both because I have started from just like physical fight because the very first day we were very much afraid that Vladimir Putin was going to capture Kyiv right away in the very first night, and I don't want to sound too pathetic, but we were preparing to die, but to defend the city. But later it became clear that his blitzkrieg is wearing off and that he's not successful. And then we started to think about the changes in Russia. And I think that by invading Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has actually signed the death sentence for himself, not for Ukrainians, but for himself. And now we need people who would execute it.
I want to get on to what may or may not happen to Vladimir Putin a bit later. But you used to be an MP in the Russian Duma. You represented the Siberian city of Novosibirsk. You're now in the strange position where you might potentially be fighting against the very people you represented. Is that an uncomfortable position for you to be in?
It is very uncomfortable position because I am very much sorry for my compatriots and for many of my friends. You know, actually, the story is that the first Russian general which was killed in action in Ukraine, his name is Andrei Sukhovetsky. He was the deputy commander-in-chief of one of 14 armies, Russian armies, which are now inside Ukraine. And this guy is from Novosibirsk, and he was actually campaigning for me. I know him quite well. He was supporting me when I was the member of the parliament. Unfortunately, in 2014, again, being a military person, he decided that his duty was to follow the orders, and he became the division chief in Crimea for airborne. And then he was relocated to Novorossiysk, which is also on the Black Sea. And then he got promoted to this deputy commander-in-chief and perished in Ukraine.
That's extraordinary. Well, you've clearly decided your duties lie elsewhere. You wrote recently on Facebook, I, Ilya Vladimirovich Ponomaryov, offer $1 million to whoever brings Vladimir Putin, dead or alive, to an international court. Now, isn't that incitement to violence and exactly the kind of thing that gives Putin an excuse to say that Ukraine is an existential threat to Russia?
Oh, come on. It's Vladimir Putin who is an existential threat for Ukraine and to me personally. He is a war criminal. He is right now killing civilians in Ukraine massively. And the death count is already in tens of thousands of civilians. He is not very much successful in killing Ukrainian military, but he is extremely successful in killing Ukrainian civilians.
What I mean is it gives him an excuse to say that what he is doing is justified.
No, it's not an excuse. War criminals needs to be captured and war criminals needs to be exterminated. And war criminals have no nationality. War criminals are war criminals. And Nuremberg is something that awaits him ahead, and somebody needs to facilitate it. And actually, the city of Kharkiv, the first city that was besieged by Vladimir Putin, it's a sister city to Nuremberg. It's a sister city to Novosibirsk in Russia, but it's also a sister city to Nuremberg in Germany. And I think it's very symbolic.
The Ukrainian armed forces have done a much better job than most people expected at holding back the Russian advance. You said yourself you expected in the early days that Kiev would be taken. But the reality is that Russia has vastly superior manpower and firepower. And surely the longer this goes on, the worse it'll be for Ukrainians.
You know, actually, in terms of manpower, I would rather disagree with you. Because if we look at the numbers of Russian army and the numbers of Ukrainian army, then Ukraine currently supersedes Russia, and it definitely has way more experienced people.
Well, the Russian armed forces comprises around 900,000 active duty soldiers. That, at the start of this conflict, that was 8 times the size of the Ukrainian army, which I think has grown now somewhat, but still many times larger.
No, the Ukrainian army was 350 or something like that. Then Ukrainian army had 400,000 in reserve people with the experience in fighting in Donbass. Plus, additionally, this territorial defense that we were talking about from the very beginning, which has a capacity of up to 1 million, and right now there are 200 active servicemen in this type of service. So altogether, we get into the same 950, but the potential to grow it is even higher.
Are you saying you believe that Ukraine could win this war militarily, secure a Russian defeat?
No, yes, that's exactly what I'm thinking. I think that I would put it to be exact. I think that there is no way Russia can win this war militarily. That probably would be the most accurate statement, because Russia theoretically can take over one or another city. Russia can secure control over a certain part of Ukrainian territory. But Ukrainians would have unlimited support for partisan action, and they can last way longer, and it's their motherland, and they are not going to go away.
So if, as you say, the Ukrainian armed forces are capable of winning this war, then why are you and other Ukrainians, all the way up to President Zelensky, asking for a no-fly zone?
No, that's the most difficult part for us. Firstly, it's a huge humanitarian catastrophe, which we are experiencing right now. And you saw what's going on in Mariupol. You saw what's going on in Kharkiv. You saw what's going on in other cities. Right now, there are very active shellings of Kyiv. And that also Russian army, unfortunately, they are not targeting military objects as they claim. They target just plain civilian houses. And what they want to bring to the cities is a plain terror. They are not trying to combat military because there are no such targets in Ukraine. It's very well thought of. But yeah, so that the first thing is humanitarian thing, but the second thing is also a military thing, because Ukrainians cannot assemble and start an offensive, because when you don't control the air, the offensive will have a devastative effect on the Ukrainian military.
Well, NATO leaders have made it clear there will be no-fly zone. President Biden has said we will not fight a war against Russia in Ukraine. Direct confrontation between NATO and Russia is World War III. Well, he says it's World War III.
World War III is coming to your neighborhood already. And if Putin would be victorious in Ukraine, you would have this World War III. And I think that, Gabriel, you as a British person should remember what Prime Minister Churchill once said, that if you want to avoid it, you will have both the shame and the war.
President Zelensky has said, I think that without negotiations, we cannot end this war. He's also indicated that he may be willing to concede some things for peace, including possibly NATO membership, possibly recognizing Crimea as Russian territory. What compromises do you think Ukraine could make in order to achieve peace?
Well, firstly, President Zelensky is 100% right. Whatever is the outcome of the war would be ended with the peace talks. Even World War II ended with peace talks. But it was a peace talk about the conditions of capitulation of fascist Germany. And that would be the same what would be happening here. Recognition of Crimea or recognition of the so-called People Republics is not on the table. Yeah, I think that Ukraine very much likely to compromise on the NATO membership, because President Zelensky many times repeated that since NATO doesn't want us anyway, then okay, so we can debate. But first step should be a liberation of Ukrainian territory in full, including Crimea and Donbass.
I want to move on to what may or may not be going on inside the Kremlin. You know something of Vladimir Putin's inner circle. You worked for the government. You worked with Vladislav Surkov, a man who was once known as the author of Putinism. What do you think is going on behind those walls?
I think that right now there is an active search of who is at fault for what's going on in Ukraine. As I think that, firstly, obviously, the generals, they are a bit scared to report the truth, but they obviously know the truth. And if you attentively study the Russian mediascape during the last weeks, you would see that for approximately 11 days, neither Minister of Defense Shoigu nor Chief of Staff Gerasimov, General Gerasimov, are visible on the TV screen.
I think Shoigu just reappeared, actually, in the past couple of hours. But
he reappeared. Yeah. He reappeared with a visit to the hospital. Yes, because there were too many rumors, why he disappeared.
You said you think the generals know the truth. Do you think Vladimir Putin knows the truth, or is he getting his news from unreliable sources?
No, he's getting his news from generals. I was among those who made the wrong prediction that there would be no war. I actually was saying this many times, and I didn't believe the American intelligence that the war is imminent. And the reason why I didn't believe in it, because for me it was absolutely clear that this war would be suicidal for Vladimir Putin, and I know him quite well as a rational person. So I thought that it's no way he would do it. But he has done it. Why? Because he had the wrong information.
So you don't think he's turned into an irrational person? You think he was badly informed?
Yeah, I think he was. I think that it's very much because of the pandemic. He was sitting for a very long time in his bunker with a very limited circle of people whom he was communicating with, and his most usual confidants were Nikolai Patrushev, the national security chief, and Yuri Kovalchuk,
former KGB colleagues, yes. US intelligence has said they believe that Putin has a tendency to double down when he feels cornered. So the Americans have quite a delicate balance to tread here. Fiona Hill, a former advisor to President Trump, said Putin is making it very clear that nuclear is on the table, and every time you think, no, he wouldn't, would he? Well, yes, he would. What do you think could be a so-called off-ramp for Vladimir Putin, a way out?
There is no way out already. There's just none, unfortunately. I don't see any, because for any way out, he needs to be able to claim a victory in Ukraine. And there is no way it's happening. That's why there is no way out. And I think that the sooner the West would recognize that this regime needs to be overthrown and Putin personally eliminated, the better it would be. We can do it, Russians, Ukrainians can do it, Americans can do it, but it needs to be done.
I want to get on to that in a minute, but first, let's talk a little bit about how we got here. In 2014, after a revolution in Kiev that overthrew a pro-Russian president, Russia annexed Crimea, and you were the only member of the Russian Duma, the parliament, to vote against that annexation. Why?
Exactly because of what we see now. That's what I wrote. I said that historically, maybe Crimea is Russian. I may even admit that maybe a majority of Crimeans wanted to be with Russia, although right now it doesn't seem to be the case. But it doesn't matter, because it was the annexation, it was no referendums or nothing like this, and it would mean inevitable war between Russia and Ukraine, to closest neighbors, brothers, allies, whatever.
Which sounded at the time like a very prophetic, or looks from this vantage point like a prophecy. But you also said at the time, I think that Crimea should be part of Russia. I think it is Russian land. I think we should all be together, Ukrainians and Belarusians and Russians and many other countries which were once part of the USSR. We are one family, we have a common history. How is that vision different from that of Vladimir Putin?
Well, you see, the fact that we are related to each other, it doesn't mean that the people of Ukraine, of Belarus, or of Russia has the right for self-determination. And what I was saying at that time is that if Crimeans would run their legitimate referendum, made a legitimate public and fair discussion of how they want to live, we should honor their opinion. Like I would say the same thing about Scotland or Ireland. It would be absolutely the same. But it has to be done through a civilized procedure. And what actually happened in Crimea was the opposite. It was firstly the annexation. The military was introduced to Crimea. And then under these rifles, under the guns, a so-called referendum has been conducted. No, that's not the procedure we're talking about.
I'm just trying to get a sense of whether your views have changed in the intervening 8 years. Vladimir Putin has said that Russia is fighting a regime of fascists and neo-Nazis in Ukraine. I mean, that's clearly nonsense. Presumably, you reject that too.
Yes, absolutely. I never thought that. And my position was always that, yeah, we need to be friends. I am leftist. I am internationalist. I believe in unions. I believe in the world without borders, where people can move freely, can talk freely, can work freely, can educate freely. can enjoy their life freely without any artificial restrictions like the borders, visas, and so on and so forth. But again, this has to be done through the self-determination of people. They should decide.
Let me move on to what Russians might, could or should do in these circumstances. In 2011-2012, you were among protesters on the streets of Moscow. That was the last time there was a serious mobilization, a popular mobilization against Vladimir Putin. What chances are there of such a movement happening again under the current circumstances?
I think that unarmed movement is not so possible because, again, people are rational. They don't want to go to jail for nothing. They want to do something which is reasonable. So there is obviously, a certain circle of people who are not politicized, but who are dissidents, who want to express their moral position. And even this such number of people is pretty reasonable, as we saw the war protest against the war, despite all the new oppression laws that Russian State Duma has passed.
That's right, but 14,000 people have been arrested. There seems to be serious repressions going on.
Yeah, but that's exactly my point, and people don't see the point. Why should they do it? So they expressed their opinion once, and we know that these people exist. And we know that even according to the official polls, 1/3 of Russian population is against this war. To my mind, it's way larger because
but 60% are in favor, according to the last independent pollster. You wrote recently, you said, I would be surprised if Putin was still in the Kremlin next year. Under these circumstances, where does the challenge to him come from?
I even wrote not that he would not be in the Kremlin. I think that he would not be on this planet, that he would not be alive next year.
Well, where do you think, what is the mechanism for his removal?
I think right now there would be a competition between 4 different forces. One is Russian people, and I think that the demand for the armed protest is rising. And it's quite possible that this demand would be met.
But you're talking about civil war in Russia.
That's what Putin has started on the 24th of February. When he attacked Ukraine, he started an imperialist war. And as classics of Russian Revolution once said, after imperialist war, there would be a civil war. It's inevitable. And that would happen.
You talk about,
that's where we target.
You talk about bringing Putin down, but there's one big question. Who is going to replace him? There isn't anyone who's obvious.
No, that's very much dependent on who would bring him down. There's one question, if there would be Russian people, and if it would be Russian people, most likely this armed protest would be predominantly leftist and nationalist. If there would be some coup, some palace coup, so to say, then most likely there will be liberals, and there are people like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, for example, who are clearly betting on this scenario. But then there could be a scenario of just plain, straightforward military defeat by Ukrainians, and then it would be Ukrainian soldier. But also I would not exclude if Mr. Putin would wave with his nukes above his head, then there would be American troopers who would take care of this.
Very briefly, Ilya Ponomaryov, 6 years ago on this program, you compared Russia to Germany in the 1930s. Today, what are your thoughts? Hitler's Germany? Stalin's Russia?
No, it's not Stalin's Russia. Frankly, it's not Hitler's Germany, but it's so close to it that, to all practical senses, yes, it is Hitler's Germany.
Ilya Ponomaryov, thank you for being on Hard Talk.
Thanks for having me.
Hello, I'm Ross Atkins with Outside Source. This is the extraordinary story of climate change. Vaccines, Europe, the Taliban, China. There is an awful lot to consider. Let's take this stage by stage. Here's the BBC's Stephen McDonald in Beijing. So help me understand the politics of this. Let's look at some of the international reaction. Tell us what you've been hearing. In practical terms, what does that mean? Next, we have to step back and let's just remind ourselves this is all part of the same story.
Piece the story together with Ross Atkins. Outside Source on BBC World News.
Hello there. Temperatures are going to be near record-breaking across parts of California and the southwest around the Great Basin region over the next couple of days, thanks to high pressure and winds coming in from the southeast. Different story, though, further east. We've got a plunge of cold air moving down across the Midwest into much of the eastern half of the United States behind this weather front. Certainly as we head on into the weekend and into next week. But in the short term, it will be fairly mild with some sunshine. A vigorous area of low pressure has brought flooding downpours, parts of Paraguay and into the northeast of Argentina. Gale force winds as well. But on Friday into the weekend, that system should be clearing away. Much of Europe bathed in sunshine thanks to a big area of high pressure. But we've got low pressure affecting southern and eastern Spain. Some heavy rainfall here, strong winds. Gradually, temperatures, though, will be recovering across Greece and the islands as that area of low pressure clears away eastwards. Some chilly weather, though, for the northwest of Africa, though conditions look a little bit better in Morocco for Saturday as that low pressure eventually weakens and allows plenty of sunshine to move in its place. The Middle East will be dry, plenty of sunshine this weekend. Fairly strong shamal, though, around the Gulf. That could lift up some dust, and temperatures will be recovering around the Levant and into the Caucasus, but there'll still be some snow showers around over the high ground. Thunderstorms are likely to break out again across southern and western India this weekend. A few across the northeast, but central northern India will be hot and sunny with temperatures into the low 40s in the hottest spots. This area of low pressure will clear away from eastern China by Friday night. So Saturday will be lying across the Korean Peninsula and Japan, bringing heavy rain, also strong gale force winds. Now, some unwelcome rainfalls pushing into parts of New South Wales, southern Queensland, not just for the weekend, into much of next week as well. So that's pretty bad news there, areas which have seen such severe flooding. For New Zealand, it's an improving picture this weekend with high pressure building in.
When you come to this contemporary period, they are unafraid to address issues such as gender or politics, and very often the works test the boundaries of censorship.
There it is.
It's beautiful, beautiful, so enigmatic. A Neanderthal woman or man or child made those marks for a reason.
What I love about when somebody really laughs is the chaos of the features and the abandonment.
The vehicle in which people are being creative is not what we should focus on. What we should focus on is the talent and the creativity itself.
Inspiring arts and culture on BBC World News.
On the Belarusian side, migrants started throwing rocks and bricks and branches towards the Polish forces.
A week of commemorative events in honor of Archbishop Tutu is well underway all over South Africa.
There's more trouble here in the Netherlands. Small groups of people destroying things in the northern city of Groningen.
The clashes are taking place just a few hundred meters away from where I'm standing now. You can hear the sound of shooting and explosions.
This is a storm that has now claimed at least 14 lives overnight. You had people rushing to their basements.
We break stories from more places than any other international news broadcaster. We are the leaders in global breaking news.
Hello, I'm Lewis Vaughan-Jones. This is Outside Source. A united front by Western leaders 1 month on from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Meeting in Brussels, they promised to increase military aid to Ukraine and send 40,000 more troops to countries in Eastern Europe.
NATO has never been more united than it is today. Putin is getting exactly the opposite what he intended to have as a consequence of going into Ukraine.
There are new Western sanctions against Russia too, with the US joining the UK in targeting hundreds of politicians in the State Duma. We'll bring you a special report from the front line in the city of Kharkiv. That's under constant Russian bombardment.
You can see what they're up against here. This is daily, but the steadfastness of these men is being felt not just in Kharkiv, but around the world. They've had 4 weeks of this, and still they remain. The Russians haven't been able to break their lines.
In other news, here in the UK, P&O Ferries admit they did break the law when they sacked 800 staff without consultation. Hello, welcome to the programme. We start with a big day of diplomacy in Brussels. World leaders have gathered there for 3 summits in a show of unity against Russia's war in Ukraine. First up, NATO, the security alliance of 30 countries from North America and Europe. Next, the G7, leaders from the US, UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy and Japan were all there. And within the past hour, the US president has joined European leaders for an EU Council meeting, also in the Belgian capital. Let's begin, though, with NATO and Joe Biden's verdict on the unity of that alliance over the crisis.
Putin was banking on NATO being split. My early conversation with him in December and early January, it was clear to me he didn't think we could sustain this cohesion. NATO has never been more united than it is today. Putin is getting exactly the opposite what he intended to have as a consequence of going into Ukraine. We've built that same unity with the European Union and with the leading democracies of the G7.
While the leaders of the military alliance approved plans to send 40,000 more troops to Eastern Europe to tackle what they describe as the biggest security crisis in a generation. 4 new NATO battle groups are to be sent to its eastern flank, to Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria and Romania. Here's NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg on the deployments.
So we are resetting NATO's deterrence and defence for the long term. With more troops, with more air assets.